My name is Leona Vance. I am 26 years old. Yesterday, I returned from an 18-month overseas deployment as a combat nurse. I stepped out of a transport vehicle in front of my childhood home in North Carolina, carrying a canvas duffel bag and the bone-deep exhaustion that only comes from surviving a war zone. I survived because of Titan, my Belgian Malinois, a decorated military working dog who saved my life twice. I left him in the care of my parents, assuming blood meant loyalty. I was wrong. I walked up my parents' driveway and found an empty kennel. They did not just give him away. While I was pulling shrapnel out of soldiers, my parents sold my service dog for $30,000. They told the buyer I had suffered a catastrophic brain injury and was locked away in a psychiatric ward. They used the money to buy country club dinners and diamond bracelets. They had no idea I tracked the buyer down. They had no idea the buyer kept the receipts. And what I did next cost them their home, their freedom, and their flawless reputation. Before I take you back to that sweltering July afternoon, take a second to hit subscribe to Luke Vengeance. Drop a comment and let me know your age and where you are listening from today. It means a lot to me. Now let me take you back to the moment I dropped my bag on the concrete. The rusted padlock hit the pavement with a hollow clatter. The North Carolina heat radiated off the asphalt, but a cold numbness crept up my spine. For 18 months, the only thing that kept me sane was the promise of this reunion. I expected the frantic scramble of paws against the chain-link fence. I expected the heavy, comforting weight of Titan slamming into my chest. Instead, I stared at a sanitized enclosure. The air did not smell like dog. It smelled of industrial bleach and citrus solvent. His chew toys, his frayed training lead, the ceramic water bowl with the chip on the side, they were all gone. The concrete pad had been pressure washed until it gleamed. It erased every trace that a living, breathing hero had ever been there. Well, do not just stand out there melting. The air conditioning is running. I blinked. The jarring sound of my mother's voice snapped me out of the nightmare. Helen Vance sat on the wraparound porch of our colonial home, resting in a wicker chair with a glass of iced sweet tea sweating in her hand. She wore a crisp linen blouse. Her ash blonde hair was perfectly styled. She looked every bit the pristine Carolina matriarch. Our town sits near Fort Liberty. In this part of the state, supporting the military is a deeply respected way of life. But not in the Vance household. My parents are obsessed with elite prestige. They worship my older brother David and his Ivy League medical degree. They fund his business class flights and Michelin star dinners without a second thought. I graduated near the top of my class with a prestigious law degree, but when I chose to enlist as a combat nurse and military dog trainer, instead of joining a corporate firm, they treated my career like a trivial afterthought, an embarrassment. I forced my boots to move forward. "Where is he, Mom?" Helen sighed, a delicate, practiced flutter of exasperation. She set the tea down on the glass patio table. As she moved, the sunlight caught a blinding flash of refracted light. A new, intricately set diamond tennis bracelet circled her wrist. The platinum clasp clinked softly against the glass. "He became a nuisance, Leona," she said, smoothly adjusting her designer sunglasses. "He was pacing the fence line all night, barking at the neighbor's landscaping crew. Your father and I could not sleep. The Homeowners Association sent 2 warning letters. We had to think of the neighborhood." "A nuisance," I repeated the word. My voice was flat. "He is a certified service animal. He found 3 improvised explosive devices in combat. He is not a puppy who chewed up your hydrangeas." "He was erratic," Helen countered, her tone hardening. "And you were not here to manage him. We did what was best. We found a nice family in the foothills who had land for him to run on. You should be thanking us." I stepped onto the porch. The tactical instincts drilled into me over the past 4 years flared to life. My mother was not just lying. She was performing. The casual posture, the rehearsed dismissal of my panic, the sudden appearance of high-end jewelry on a woman who complained about inflation just last month. This was not an inconvenience. This was a transaction. I looked from her face down to the sparkling diamonds on her wrist. Who, I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low, who has my dog? Helen crossed her legs, leaning back into the cushions. It was months ago, sweetheart. Your father handled the paperwork. Now bring your bags inside. You look exhausted, and your father is making dinner. The exhaustion evaporated. The daughter who had longed for the safety of home vanished, replaced entirely by the combat nurse who knew exactly how to triage a bleeding wound. The battle had not ended in the desert. It was waiting for me right here on the front porch. I turned my back on her and walked through the front door, not toward the kitchen, but straight toward my father's home office. I left my mother sitting on the porch with her sweet tea and her stolen diamonds. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the oppressive Carolina heat. The interior of the house was cool and perfectly silent. It felt like walking into a mausoleum. I bypassed the grand staircase in the formal living room, heading straight down the hall toward my father's home office. My father, Edward Vance, treated his office like a sanctuary. It was a room paneled in dark mahogany and scented with expensive cigar smoke. During my childhood, I was barely allowed to step across the threshold. Today, I did not ask for permission. I stepped inside and firmly locked the heavy door behind me. I did not come home to play the victim. I am a combat nurse. I am trained to assess trauma, stabilize the environment, and execute a plan. I needed data. If my parents had given Titan to another family, there would be a paper trail, a transfer of ownership, veterinary records, a microchip update form, something. I began a systematic search of the room. My tactical training took over, muting the emotional shock of the empty kennel outside. I moved with quiet precision. I checked the obvious places first, the filing cabinets in the corner, the stacked mail on the credenza. Nothing. My father was a man obsessed with control and prestige. He hid his most valuable secrets in plain sight, but always under lock and key. I approached his massive executive desk. The top drawers yielded nothing but custom stationery and expensive fountain pens. The bottom right drawer was locked. A standard brass tumbler lock. I knelt on the plush carpet, pulling a small tension wrench and a pick from the survival kit in my cargo pocket. 10 seconds later, the cylinder clicked and the drawer slid open. There were no veterinary files inside. There were no transfer papers for a Belgian Malinois. Instead, I found a thick, leather-bound portfolio. The gold-embossed letters on the cover read, Asset Management. I opened the portfolio and flipped through the crisp pages. The breath caught in my throat. These were not my father's corporate investment portfolios. These were offshore bank statements alongside domestic routing records, and printed at the top of every single page was my name, Leona Vance. My fingers traced the columns of numbers. This was my primary deployment savings account. This was where my combat hazard pay was deposited every month. I had granted my father limited administrative access before I deployed overseas, strictly to handle my student loan payments from law school. I trusted him to manage the logistics while I was saving lives in a war zone. I read the current balance. The number was 0. I flipped back through the previous 18 months of ledger entries. A steady, ruthless hemorrhage of funds painted a grotesque picture of greed. Over $40,000 had been drained from my account. I earned that money pulling shrapnel out of teenagers in the desert. I earned that money sleeping in Kevlar and dodging mortar fire. My father had used my blood money to fund a country club fantasy. The line items were a sickening inventory of luxury. There were exorbitant monthly initiation fees paid to the South Park Country Club. There were lease payments for a brand new imported German sedan. I found a massive charge from a boutique jeweler in downtown Raleigh, dated just 3 weeks ago. The exact cost of the diamond tennis bracelet currently sitting on my mother's wrist stared back at me in black and white ink. They had not just sold my dog. They had financially gutted me. I did not scream. I did not throw the portfolio across the room. I compartmentalized the rage, packing it down into a tight, hard box inside my chest. I pulled out my phone and photographed every single page, capturing the account numbers, the routing digits, and the exact dates of the fraudulent transfers. I gathered the evidence, placing the portfolio back into the drawer and relocking it, leaving no trace of my search. 3 hours later, I sat at the formal dining room table. The atmosphere was suffocating. The crystal chandelier cast a harsh light over the roasted lamb and grilled asparagus my father had prepared. Helen sat across from me, cutting her meat with delicate, precise movements. The diamonds on her wrist flashed under the bulbs. Edward Vance poured himself a generous glass of expensive Cabernet. He wore a tailored suit even in his own home, projecting the image of a Carolina elite. He swirled the dark wine and sighed deeply, acting burdened by his own success. "The economy is a disaster, Leona," he announced, cutting into his dinner, "and the government oversight is getting worse. My firm had to deal with nosy bank auditors all week. They demand paperwork for every minor transaction. It is an insult to men of standing." I stared at him. The hypocrisy was so thick I could hardly breathe. Thankfully, Edward continued taking a long sip of wine. "Relationships are the real currency in this state. I played 18 holes with the local district judge today. Good man. He understands how things work. He keeps the local riffraff in line and protects the community pillars. You should remember that, Leona. Who you know is far more important than what you know." It was a dark, arrogant boast. He was subtly reminding me of his power, establishing his territory and his untouchable status within the corrupt local network. I set my silver fork down on the porcelain plate. The sharp clinking sound silenced the room. I looked directly into my father's eyes. "Where is my hazard pay, Edward?" The charming paternal mask slipped off his face instantly. He stopped chewing. He slowly placed his wineglass back onto the table. The silence in the dining room stretched out heavy and venomous. Helen froze her knife hovering over her plate. "I managed your finances while you were unreachable, Leona," he said. His voice was smooth, but his eyes went completely dead. Two cold, dark stones calculating a threat. "You drained $40,000, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "You paid for a country club membership. You leased a luxury vehicle. You bought a diamond bracelet. That was combat pay." Edward dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin. "Do not use that dramatic tone with me, young lady. You were living rent-free in my house before you enlisted. Consider it back rent. Consider it storage fees for the boxes you left in the attic. There are administrative costs associated with handling your complex affairs while you play soldier halfway across the world. You owe us for raising you." I pushed my chair back and stood up. The combat nurse and the lawyer inside me merged into a single lethal force. "I am calling the military police," I said. "I am handing over the routing numbers to a federal investigator. You committed wire fraud." Edward did not flinch. He leaned back in his mahogany chair, resting his hands on his stomach. A cruel, mocking smile curled the corners of his lips. "Go ahead," he whispered. "Call them. Tell them your story." He tilted his head, studying me like a specimen in a jar. "Let us think about how that will look, Leona. A traumatized combat nurse returns from a grueling overseas deployment. She is paranoid. She is erratic. She makes wild, baseless accusations against her prominent, upstanding parents, who are respected pillars of the Carolina community." My mother kept her eyes glued to her plate, refusing to intervene. "I play golf with the district judge," Edward continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous hush. "I serve on the board of the local hospital. If you make one phone call, I will have my medical colleagues place you under an involuntary psychiatric hold. I will tell them the war broke your mind. I will have you declared mentally unfit to handle your own affairs. Who do you think they will believe? A decorated local businessman or a hysterical veteran suffering from post-traumatic stress?" The air left my lungs. He was weaponizing my service against me. He was fully prepared to lock me in a psychiatric ward to protect his stolen money and his pristine reputation. I was trapped behind enemy lines in my own childhood home. The local authorities were compromised. My family was a parasitic entity willing to destroy my freedom to maintain their country club lifestyle. I stared at the man who raised me, realizing I had to fight a war on two fronts. I needed leverage he could not control. And I remembered the single shredded piece of paper I had found at the very bottom of his office trash can. A torn bill of sale containing a partial address and the name of the man who bought my dog. Thorne. My childhood bedroom still had the same floral wallpaper I picked out when I was 12 years old. Standing in the center of the room felt like visiting a museum exhibit dedicated to a naive girl who no longer existed. I dropped my duffel bag onto the mattress and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I needed to turn this suffocating shrine into a tactical command center. I pulled my laptop from my bag and booted it up. My first priority was stopping the financial hemorrhage. If my father thought his arrogant threats in the dining room would paralyze me, he severely underestimated the resilience built during consecutive tours in a combat zone. I dialed the fraud division of my bank. I listened to the smooth jazz hold music while pacing the length of the room. My boots sunk into the plush carpet. The Carolina heat pressed against the window panes, but my mind was operating with ice-cold clarity. A representative named Sarah finally answered the line. I identified myself using my military identification number and my Social Security details. I reported unauthorized transfers totaling over $40,000. I expected Sarah to freeze the accounts immediately. I expected her to initiate a federal fraud investigation and lock my father out of the system. Instead, the line went dead silent. Sarah cleared her throat. Her voice shifted from eager customer service to uncomfortable corporate defense. She informed me that the transfers were perfectly legal. I stopped pacing. I demanded a detailed explanation. Sarah told me the bank had a notarized document on file. It was a general power of attorney granting Edward Vance unrestricted access to liquidate, transfer, and manage all my personal and financial assets. The words hit me harder than a physical strike. I have a law degree from a top-tier university. My parents practically worship my older brother David and his Ivy League medical degree. They fund his lavish lifestyle and brag about him to their country club friends. Meanwhile, they treat my legal education like a trivial hobby because I chose to serve my country instead of joining a corporate firm. But I know the law. I know exactly what a general power of attorney entails. It is a financial blank check. It strips away every layer of personal sovereignty and hands the keys to someone else. I closed my eyes and the memory surfaced with sickening precision. It happened 2 days before my deployment. I was sitting in my apartment, packing my tactical gear. My mind was already thousands of miles away, focused on survival protocols and combat triage. My father walked into my living room carrying a thick stack of manila folders. He played the role of the caring protector flawlessly. He told me he needed my signature on a few mundane bureaucratic forms: vehicle registration renewals, local property tax exemptions for active duty service members. He handed me a blue ink pen and pointed to the dotted lines. He weaponized my trust. He buried the general power of attorney right in the middle of the stack. I signed it without reading the fine print because he was my father. I trusted his blood. He used my own legal credentials and my deployment distraction to construct an airtight financial trap. I hung up the phone. The bank could not help me. My father had covered his tracks with legitimate ink. I needed law enforcement. I grabbed my car keys and drove straight to the local police precinct. The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt, but my hands gripping the steering wheel were freezing. I walked into the station ready to file grand larceny and stolen property charges. The lobby smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. I approached the high front desk. The officer on duty looked up from his computer monitor. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. I knew him, Officer Miller. He was a regular guest at my parents' lavish summer barbecues. He played poker with my father every other Thursday at the country club. Miller recognized me instantly. He offered a wide, friendly smile that did not reach his eyes. He asked how my tour of duty went. I ignored the pleasantries. I laid out the raw facts. I told him my father stole my combat pay and illegally sold a certified military working dog. I demanded to file an official criminal report. Miller leaned back in his squeaky office chair, folding his arms across his uniform. The friendly demeanor vanished in an instant. He looked at me with a patronizing stare. He told me Edward had already called the station earlier that morning. My father had preemptively warned the police that I was having a tough time readjusting to civilian life. Miller used the phrase combat fatigue with a heavy sigh. He suggested I go home and get some rest. He told me a financial dispute between family members was a civil matter, not a criminal one. Furthermore, he claimed a dog is legally considered property. Since my father possessed a valid power of attorney, he had the full legal right to rehome the animal. I pressed my hands flat against the cold laminate counter. Titan is not just property, I said, keeping my voice dangerously steady. He is highly trained, government-certified medical equipment. Selling him for profit is a felony. Miller narrowed his eyes. He leaned forward and lowered his voice so the other officers in the bullpen could not hear him. Listen to me, Leona. Your father is a highly respected man in this town. He donates a lot of money to the Police Athletic League. If you start making wild accusations, people are going to question your mental stability. Do not force us to call a psychiatric evaluator down here. You need to drop this nonsense and go home. The trap was fully illuminated. The local authorities were compromised. The bank was legally bound. My father had orchestrated a masterpiece of isolation. I walked out of the precinct and got back into my car. I did not shed a single tear. Tears are a useless response to a tactical disadvantage. I drove back to the house. I parked 2 streets over so my parents would not hear my arrival. I slipped through the back patio door and crept into my father's home office one more time. My father was an arrogant man. Arrogant men always make mistakes because they believe their power makes them untouchable. I checked the small wastebasket under his mahogany desk. It was empty. But my father owned a heavy-duty cross-cut shredder. The plastic bin underneath the steel blades was half full. I detached the bin, dumped the contents into a black garbage bag, and sneaked back upstairs to my bedroom. I locked the door and dumped the shredded ribbons of paper onto my bed. Hundreds of tiny white fragments mixed with glossy credit card offers and junk mail. I sat cross-legged on the mattress. I spent the next 4 hours sifting through the debris. My vision blurred. My shoulders ached from leaning over. But the image of an empty, sanitized kennel kept my hands moving. I sorted the strips by color, thickness, and font size. I ignored the junk mail. I was looking for anything related to a veterinary clinic or a livestock transfer. Around midnight, I found a thick piece of premium bond paper. It had a partial watermark. I grabbed a roll of clear tape and began piecing the strips together on my flat wooden desk. It was agonizing work. Every matched edge felt like diffusing a tiny explosive device. Slowly, a single document took shape under the glow of my desk lamp. It was not a veterinary record. It was a crude, typed receipt. A bill of sale. I taped the final shred into place and read the reconstructed page. The header read, "Transfer of surplus canine." My blood ran cold. Surplus. Like a broken desk chair or a rusted-out vehicle. The purchase price was listed at $30,000. My father had traded a decorated hero for the exact price of his new luxury sedan down payment. I scanned the bottom of the page for a signature. The buyer had signed his name with a heavy black pen. The dark ink had bled through the paper slightly. The last name was Thorne. Beneath the signature was a partial address. The shredder blades had destroyed the specific street number, but the zip code and the town name remained intact. It was a small, unincorporated community nestled deep in the rugged western foothills of the state. It was a remote, mountainous area known for thick forests, isolated cabins, and private security compounds. The paralyzing grip of victimization shattered into a million pieces. I was no longer a trapped daughter fighting ghosts in a corrupt town. I was a combat nurse with a specific mission. I had a target. I had a direction. I pulled a rugged canvas backpack from the top shelf of my closet. I packed a heavy-duty flashlight, a trauma first aid kit, and a folding tactical knife. I was going to the foothills. I was going to find a man named Thorne, and I was going to get my partner back. I left the manicured lawns of my parents' neighborhood before the sun came up. The drive west took 3 hours. The smooth coastal highways gradually gave way to winding mountain asphalt. The elevation climbed, and the air grew noticeably thinner. Thick stands of Appalachian pine replaced the ornamental palm trees of the Carolina suburbs. I kept the windows rolled down, letting the sharp morning chill bite my skin to keep my senses sharp. I was hunting a ghost, using nothing but a zip code and a ripped piece of paper. The community I entered was not a tourist destination. It was a rugged enclave tucked deep into the Blue Ridge foothills. People moved up here when they wanted to be left alone. Off-grid cabins hidden behind dense foliage and miles of private dirt roads dominated the landscape. I spent 2 hours navigating unmarked gravel pathways, checking mailboxes against local property registry maps on my phone. The cellular signal faded to 0. I relied entirely on downloaded satellite imagery. Finally, I found the location. The property sat at the dead end of a steep switchback. It was not a simple residential cabin. It was a fortified compound. A heavy wrought iron gate blocked the driveway, anchored by thick stone pillars. High-definition surveillance cameras tracked my vehicle the moment my tires crunched onto the gravel. A bright yellow sign warned of armed response. I parked my car directly in front of the gate blocking the entrance. I did not come to knock politely. I needed to force an engagement. I stepped out of my vehicle, leaving the engine running. I walked right up to the lens of the primary security camera. I stared directly into the glass optic. "My name is Leona Vance," I said, projecting my voice clearly into the hidden microphone. "You have my dog. I am not leaving without him." I stepped back and waited. 3 minutes passed in absolute silence. Only the wind rustled the pine branches overhead. Then the heavy metal gate groaned and began to slide open. I did not wait for an invitation. I walked through the gap, my boots crunching a steady rhythm on the stone driveway. I kept my hands visible, but my posture remained braced for contact. A man stepped out onto the wide wraparound porch of the main log structure. He was roughly 60 years old, but his posture belonged to a much younger man. His shoulders were broad, his jaw set in a rigid line. He wore faded tactical cargo pants and a dark utility shirt. He carried a matte black hunting rifle. He did not point the barrel at me, but he held the weapon with the relaxed, lethal competence of a combat veteran. Every muscle in his body broadcast a clear warning. This was Marcus Thorne. I stopped 10 paces from the wooden stairs. "You are trespassing, young lady," Thorne said. His voice was a deep gravel rasp cutting through the mountain air. "Turn around, get back in your sedan, and drive down the mountain before I call the local sheriff." I held my ground. "My name is Leona Vance. I tracked a bill of sale to this address. You bought a Belgian Malinois from Edward Vance. That dog is a certified service animal, and he belongs to me." Thorne narrowed his eyes. The grip on his rifle tightened slightly. He tilted his head, assessing me. He looked at my stance, my boots, the way I maintained eye contact without flinching. "You are lying," he stated flatly. "Leona Vance is incapacitated. Now turn around." Before I could argue, a loud, frantic scratching sound erupted from inside the cabin. A low, rumbling whine vibrated through the heavy wooden front door. I recognized that specific vocal pitch immediately. My heart slammed against my ribs. I took a half step forward. The screen door burst open. A blur of tan and black muscle slammed into the porch railing, scrambled over the wooden steps, and launched into the air. I braced for impact, but the momentum still knocked me backward into the gravel. I hit the dirt hard. I did not care. Heavy paws pinned my shoulders. A wet nose buried itself into my neck. He let out a high-pitched squeal, a sound reserved only for the end of a long deployment. It was Titan. He was healthy. His coat was shiny and his muscles were thick. He frantically licked my face, whimpering and burying his head under my chin. I wrapped my arms around his thick neck, burying my face in his fur. "Good boy," I whispered, my voice cracking for the first time since I stepped off the transport plane. "You are a good boy." We stayed in the dirt for a long minute. Titan refused to leave my side, pressing his entire body weight against my chest to ensure I was real. I finally sat up, wiping the dust from my jeans. I looked toward the porch. Marcus Thorne was no longer holding the rifle in a ready position. The weapon hung loosely by his side, pointing at the wooden floorboards. He stared at the two of us. The aggressive hostility in his eyes had melted away, replaced by profound confusion and a rising tide of anger. A man who spends his life working with security dogs knows exactly what a bonded pair looks like. The connection cannot be faked or replicated. Thorne walked down the steps and stopped a few feet away from us. Titan leaned against my leg, but he did not growl at Thorne. The dog recognized him as a friendly presence. I stood up, keeping my hand resting firmly on the collar of my dog. "My father stole him," I said. "He forged a power of attorney and sold him while I was stationed overseas." Thorne let out a slow, ragged breath. He ran a rough hand over his short gray hair. "He sold him to me," Thorne replied, his voice tight with restrained fury. "But he did not sell him as surplus property. He told me a very different story." Thorne gestured for me to follow him up to the porch. We sat on a pair of wooden Adirondack chairs while Titan curled securely around my boots. Thorne was a retired Marine. He spent 30 years running private security contracting across the globe before settling in the Carolina Mountains. He respected the uniform, and he honored the military bond. That was exactly why my parents targeted him. "Edward and Helen did not post an advertisement online," Thorne explained, staring out at the tree line. "They came to a local veterans charity auction 2 months ago. They looked like grieving parents. They sought me out specifically because I run a canine rehabilitation program. They told me you sustained a catastrophic traumatic brain injury during a mortar attack." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. My parents had killed me off. They declared me socially and medically dead to orchestrate a transaction. Thorne continued, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped under his skin. "Your mother cried right in front of me. She said you were permanently institutionalized in a private neurological facility in Virginia. She said the benefits barely covered the basic costs and they needed specialty care funds. They claimed they were liquidating your assets to pay for your survival. They said they could not bear to send your service dog to a random shelter. They asked if I would take him. I offered them $30,000. I considered it a patriotic donation to a wounded sibling in arms. I did not buy a dog, Leona. I funded your fake medical care." The depth of the betrayal broke through the floor of my imagination. My parents were not just greedy. They were running a highly sophisticated fraud operation, leveraging the patriotic reverence of the local community. They exploited the deepest cultural values of North Carolina. They used the honor of the uniform to line their own pockets. If they lied to Marcus Thorne about a traumatic brain injury, they had undoubtedly lied to others. They were actively soliciting donations based on a fictional tragedy. They were using my name and my service record to harvest cash from wealthy, sympathetic donors. I looked at the retired Marine. "My father thinks he is untouchable because he plays golf with the district judge," I said. "I cannot fight him through the local police. They are all in his pocket. If I accuse him of theft, he will claim I am a delusional veteran." Thorne stood up from the wooden chair. His eyes burned with the cold, righteous wrath of a soldier who had just discovered stolen valor. Selling a working dog for profit is bad enough. Using a fabricated combat injury to scam a veteran crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. "You are right," Thorne said. "The local police will sweep this under the rug to protect his country club reputation." But Edward Vance made a fatal tactical error. He handed me a folder to prove his tragic story. Thorne walked over to a locked metal security cabinet near the front door. He punched in a keypad code and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He walked back and dropped it onto the glass patio table between us. "Inside that envelope is everything they used to convince me," Thorne said, tapping the thick paper. "And when you read what your brother David set up for them, you will realize selling your dog was only the beginning." The heavy manila envelope hit the glass patio table with a dull thud. Marcus Thorne stood up and walked into his kitchen, leaving me alone with the paperwork. He returned a moment later, carrying 2 ceramic mugs of black coffee. He set one down near my hand, but I did not reach for it. My eyes were locked on the thick brass clasp holding the dossier together. Titan rested his heavy chin on my knee, sensing the sudden drop in my heart rate. I stroked his ears, taking a slow, calculated breath. I reached forward and unsealed the envelope. The first document I pulled out was printed on what looked like official Department of Veterans Affairs letterhead. I am a combat nurse. I have filled out hundreds of medical evaluation boards and casualty reports. I know the exact typography, the specific diagnostic codes, and the bureaucratic language required for federal health records. The forgery was pristine. The document declared that Leona Vance had suffered severe blast trauma, resulting in a permanent vegetative state. It detailed fictitious neurological deficits, motor function loss, and a total lack of cognitive response. My parents had not merely stolen my money, they had clinically assassinated me on paper. I set the fake medical record aside and pulled out the next stack of paper. This was a sophisticated financial prospectus. The header read, "The Leona Vance Memorial Canine Fund." I scanned the structural details and my blood ran cold. This was not a simple GoFundMe page or a crude wire transfer scam. This was a meticulously engineered, donor-advised fund. I recognized the handiwork immediately. This was the brilliant, sociopathic creation of my older brother, David Vance. David was the golden child. He carried the Ivy League medical degree that my parents practically worshipped. While they treated my prestigious law degree like a trivial afterthought, they celebrated David with business-class flights to Europe and reservations at Michelin star restaurants. But David never wanted to practice medicine. He pivoted into corporate consulting and venture capital, using his medical pedigree to attract wealthy investors for healthcare startups. He understood complex financial vehicles better than anyone I knew. He had structured this fake charity under the umbrella of a legitimate regional community foundation. A donor-advised fund is a legal loophole. It allows an individual to create a charitable account, receive immediate tax deductions, and shield the specific outflow of cash from immediate federal scrutiny. By nesting the fund within an established foundation, David bypassed the rigorous audits that normally accompany a new nonprofit organization. It was a financial ghost ship operating in broad daylight. My brother had weaponized my military service to build a tax-free slush fund for the family. I dug deeper into the dossier and found the most damning evidence of all. Tucked inside a plastic sleeve were photocopies of handwritten correspondence. I recognized the elegant sweeping cursive immediately. It was my mother, Helen. She always prided herself on her penmanship, using custom-ordered cardstock for her social correspondence. I read the first letter. It was addressed to a local Veterans of Foreign Wars post in Wilmington. Helen had written a heart-wrenching thank you note, acknowledging a $10,000 community donation. She described her daily agony sitting by my imaginary hospital bed, watching her brave daughter stare blankly at a wall. She promised the veterans that their generous check would ensure my service dog remained fed and that my specialized neurological care would continue. I picked up the second letter. This one was addressed to a Gold Star mother, a woman who had actually lost her son in a roadside ambush 4 years prior. Helen had accepted a personal check from a grieving mother, padding her own bank account with the tears of a woman who knew real, ultimate loss. The cultural sin staring back at me was profound. In North Carolina, supporting the armed forces is not just a polite slogan pasted on a bumper sticker. It is the core gravity of the community. We are surrounded by historic bases and generational military families. Stealing from that deep well of patriotic reverence is the ultimate betrayal. It is unforgivable. I dropped the letters back onto the glass table. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, calculated rage. "We can call the state troopers," Marcus said. He leaned against the wooden porch railing, watching my face harden. "I have a contact in the State Bureau of Investigation. We hand them this folder, and your parents are wearing handcuffs by dinner time." I shook my head. I looked down at Titan, who was now sleeping peacefully across my boots. "No," I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. A conventional attack will fail. I looked up at the retired Marine. My father plays golf with the district judge. The local police desk sergeant is his weekly poker buddy. If we call law enforcement right now, my father will get a warning phone call before the cruisers even leave the station. He will use his connections to stall the warrant. David will digitally shred the donor-advised fund and route the cash into untraceable offshore accounts. Helen will burn her custom stationery in the backyard fire pit. By the time a legitimate federal investigator looks into the case, the evidence will be vaporized. My father will spin a narrative about a clerical error and use his country club influence to walk away untouched. Marcus frowned, taking a sip of his coffee. Then how do we strike the target? We take away their armor, I said. My parents do not care about the law. They care about their prestige. They care about their spotless reputation among the Carolina elite. Their social standing is the only currency that matters to them. If we attack them in the shadows, they will use their influence to crush me. We have to drag them into the brightest possible light. We have to execute a public strike so devastating that their corrupt judges and police friends will be forced to turn their backs to avoid the blast radius. Marcus set his mug down. A slow, grim smile spread across his weathered face. You need a platoon, he stated simply. He walked back over to the table and tapped the manila folder. I spent 30 years in private security contracting, Leona. The men and women who work for me are not mall guards. They are former military intelligence officers. They are cybersecurity specialists who hunt digital ghosts for a living. I have forensic accountants on retainer who can trace a single stolen dollar through 10 different shell corporations. He leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the glass. Edward Vance lied to a Marine to steal from a combat nurse. You do not have to fight this war alone. My network is your network. Tell me what you need. The psychological tension in the air shifted. The paralyzing weight of victimization dissolved entirely. I was no longer an isolated daughter reeling from a familial betrayal. I was a trained combat strategist, standing inside a secure operating base with a highly capable ally pledging his resources. I outlined the initial phase of the operation. We needed to map the exact digital footprint of the charity. We needed to identify every single donor David had solicited and trace where every dollar was currently resting. Marcus nodded, pulling a secure, encrypted phone from his cargo pocket to begin mobilizing his cyber team. Then Marcus asked the critical question. What is your position in all of this? Where do you go now? I looked at my duffel bag resting near the porch stairs. I have to go back behind enemy lines, I said. If I stayed hidden in the mountains, my father would realize his trap had failed. He would panic and initiate a cover-up. I needed to keep him comfortable. I needed to make him believe his arrogant threats had worked. I had to return to that sprawling colonial house, sit across the dining room table from the people who buried me alive, and smile. I had to play the role of the broken, defeated soldier. I had to let them think they had won, while I quietly wired their entire gilded life for detonation. I knelt down and unclipped the heavy nylon leash from Titan. I hugged his thick neck one more time, breathing in the scent of safety. I told Marcus to keep him hidden and secure. I stood up, grabbed my canvas bag, and walked toward my vehicle. The real deployment was just beginning. I parked my sedan in the circular driveway just as the Carolina sun dipped below the tall pine trees. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long time, regulating my breathing and slowing my heart rate. I had to bury the tactical combat nurse deep inside my chest and resurrect the traumatized, defeated victim my parents expected to see. I grabbed my canvas bag and walked up the brick steps. I unlocked the heavy front door and let my shoulders cave inward, adopting the physical posture of a soldier who had entirely lost the will to fight. Edward was waiting in the grand foyer. He held a crystal tumbler of expensive bourbon. The ice clinked against the glass as he took a slow, measured sip. He watched me cross the threshold with the smug, satisfied look of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. He asked where I had been all day. I dropped my gaze to the polished hardwood floor. I let my voice crack intentionally. I told him I went to the local precinct. I said Officer Miller refused to file a report because the power of attorney was legally binding. I admitted that I had no money to hire an independent lawyer. I told my father he had won. Edward smiled. It was a cold, victorious smirk that made my stomach turn. He walked over and patted my shoulder with a heavy, patronizing hand. He told me it was for my own good. He claimed the family needed to protect my assets because the war had clouded my judgment and made me dangerously paranoid. Helen floated into the foyer right on cue. She wrapped her arms around me in a suffocating embrace. Her new diamond bracelet pressed cold and hard against my spine. I did not pull away. I played the obedient, broken daughter, perfectly accepting their toxic comfort while plotting their absolute ruin. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house shifted from tense control to manic euphoria. I walked downstairs to find the large marble kitchen island buried under glossy event brochures, floral arrangements, and silk fabric swatches. Helen was vibrating with frantic energy. She poured me a cup of black coffee and slid a heavy cardstock invitation across the counter. The gold-embossed lettering read, Heroes of Carolina Gala. Helen excitedly announced that the event was scheduled for the upcoming weekend. They had booked the Grand Ballroom at a historic luxury hotel in downtown Wilmington. Wilmington is a coastal city known for old wealth and deep generational ties to the armed forces. My parents were escalating their fraud operation to a staggering new level. Helen bragged that the finalized guest list included the state governor, the local mayor, and 2 prominent base commanders from nearby military installations. They were using my fabricated medical tragedy to solicit million-dollar pledges from the highest levels of state leadership. My mother flipped through a binder of catering menus, complaining about the exorbitant cost of imported beluga caviar and champagne. She casually mentioned paying a massive rush delivery fee for a custom-tailored designer gown she planned to wear on stage. Every single luxury item, every appetizer, and every yard of silk was financed by the hazard pay I earned pulling shrapnel out of wounded teenagers in the desert. The sheer audacity of her spending was sickening, but I kept my facial expression neutral. I took a slow sip of my coffee and stared at the glossy gala brochure. I needed to control the environment at that hotel. I needed a tactical entry point that would give me unrestricted access to their presentation. I forced a weak, grateful smile and told my mother I wanted to help with the event. I said I needed a project to keep my mind occupied and distract me from my deployment trauma. I pointed out that high society events required complex digital coordination. I volunteered to organize the audiovisual tribute they planned to project during the dinner service. Helen was thrilled. She loved the idea of free labor, and she loved having me under her direct supervision. She believed keeping me busy would prevent me from causing any more trouble. She walked over to her designer handbag and pulled out a silver flash drive. She placed it into my palm, telling me it contained all the charity assets the donor lists and the raw video files they wanted to use. She instructed me to make the presentation a real tearjerker. She wanted the generals reaching for their checkbooks before the dessert course was even served. I took the silver drive upstairs to my childhood bedroom. I locked the heavy wooden door and pulled down the window blinds blocking out the morning sun. I booted up my laptop and connected to a secure, encrypted channel Marcus Thorne had established for us overnight. I plugged the drive into the USB port. My screen flooded with raw, unprotected data. I was staring directly into the central nervous system of my brother David and his fraudulent financial empire. The files revealed a sociopathic level of corporate genius. David had created a labyrinth of shell companies and fraudulent tax identification numbers to hide the stolen donations. I opened the primary ledger and saw the routing numbers for offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. Worse than the financial mechanics were the actual donor logs. I scrolled through lists containing the names of grieving military widows, retired veterans, and local patriotic businesses who had been systematically scammed out of their life savings. I highlighted every single folder and initiated a secure file transfer. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen, funneling the explosive evidence directly to the cybersecurity team Marcus had waiting on the other end of the encrypted connection. The retired Marine responded a minute later with a text on the secure channel confirming receipt of the payload. His forensic accountants were already tearing the ledgers apart, tracing every stolen dollar back to its source. The tension of living a double life grew suffocating. The house became a psychological battlefield. By day, I sat in the bright living room helping my mother pick out white rose centerpieces and listening to my father boast on the phone about his political connections. I nodded at their stories and played the submissive role without missing a cue. By night, I sat in the dark, glowing light of my computer monitor, dismantling their entire criminal enterprise, line by line. The danger of discovery was a constant, living, breathing presence in the room. On the third night of the operation, a sharp, sudden knock on my bedroom door made my heart stop. I was in the middle of downloading an email archive detailing David communicating with an offshore banker. I quickly scrambled to close the encrypted portal. I switched my browser tab to a generic wedding planning website Helen had asked me to review for floral ideas. Edward opened the door without waiting for me to answer. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the hall light, his eyes scanning the dark room. He asked why I was still awake. I pointed to the laptop screen and said I was just trying to find the perfect shade of ivory for the table runners. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, measuring my breathing and my posture. He was looking for any sign of defiance. I gave him nothing but tired compliance. Edward nodded, seemingly satisfied with my broken demeanor. He told me to get some sleep because the weekend was going to be exhausting. He closed the door, leaving me alone in the dark. I exhaled a slow, shaky breath. I reopened the encrypted channel and typed a single message to Marcus, indicating the transfer was complete. My parents believed they were marching toward their greatest social triumph. They had no idea they had handed the architect of their destruction the exact blueprints needed to burn their gilded empire to the ground. The atmosphere in my childhood home shifted the moment the silver sports car pulled into the circular driveway. I watched through the sheer living room curtains as my older brother cut the engine. David Vance stepped out onto the brick paving stones. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than a junior enlisted soldier makes in a year. He adjusted his silk tie and offered a practiced, brilliant smile to our parents, who were already rushing out the front door to greet him. My mother embraced him like a conquering hero returning from a triumphant campaign. My father clapped him on the shoulder, beaming with genuine pride. David was the undeniable golden child of the family. He possessed an Ivy League medical degree that our parents treated like a holy relic, but he had never spent a single day practicing actual medicine or treating patients. He used those elite credentials as leverage to secure venture capital, launching a series of corporate consulting firms and healthcare startups. He was a white-collar operator who trafficked in prestige and influence. I stayed inside watching the reunion from the shadows. David was far more dangerous than my father. Edward was motivated by simple greed and social vanity. David possessed a clinical, sociopathic detachment. He viewed human beings as disposable assets. We sat down for a lavish catered dinner that evening. The dining room felt like a stage production. My parents fawned over his latest business ventures, pouring expensive wine and laughing at his rehearsed anecdotes. I kept my head down. I played the exhausted, damaged veteran, pushing food around my porcelain plate. I answered their mundane questions with quiet monosyllables. Edward and Helen seemed perfectly satisfied with my muted performance. They believed I was thoroughly broken. David did not buy the act for a single second. I felt his eyes on me throughout the meal. He did not say anything confrontational at the table, but his gaze was sharp and analytical. He was studying my posture, testing my responses, searching for the tactical lie. I kept my breathing shallow and my expression blank, refusing to give him a target. The house finally went quiet around 2 a.m. I slipped out of my bedroom to get a glass of water from the kitchen. The marble floors were cold under my bare feet. I walked into the dark kitchen and froze. David was sitting on a sleek leather bar stool at the center island. The overhead lights were off. The only illumination came from the digital glow of the oven clock and the streetlights filtering through the bay windows. He held a crystal glass of scotch, swirling the amber liquid slowly. The ice clinked against the rim. It was a calculated ambush. "You can drop the shell-shocked routine, Leona," he said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone cutting through the dark. "Mom and Dad are gullible enough to believe you gave up. I know better. You are a combat nurse. You do not surrender without a casualty report." I walked over to the stainless steel refrigerator. I kept my movements deliberate and slow. I filled a glass with water and turned to face him. I maintained the facade, letting my shoulders slump. "I do not know what you mean, David. Dad has the power of attorney. I cannot fight a legal document." David took a slow sip of his drink. He set the glass down on the marble counter. A sharp, patronizing smile crossed his face. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the island. "I built the donor-advised fund," he stated bluntly. "I set up the shell corporations. I drafted the charitable charters, and I routed the offshore accounts. Dad might be the face of the operation, but I am the architect. And I know exactly what happens when someone threatens the structural integrity of my blueprints." He was dissecting the situation with terrifying precision. He did not care about the moral implications of stealing from a veteran. He only cared about the spreadsheet. I took a step closer, keeping my expression carefully neutral. "Why build a fake charity?" I asked. "You just closed a major funding round for your medical software company. Mom and Dad have been bragging about it for months." The smile vanished from his face. The charming corporate mask slipped, revealing the desperate predator underneath. "My startup is bleeding cash, Leona. We burned through $20 million in seed capital, and the software architecture is a total failure. The board of directors is preparing to vote me out by the end of the quarter. I need liquidity. I need untraceable, unregulated capital to patch the holes in my ledger before the investors demand a federal audit. The charity is my lifeline." He picked up his scotch and pointed the rim of the glass at me. "This gala on Saturday night is going to generate over $2 million in pledges from the local elite. The governor is bringing his network. The base commanders are bringing their wealthy defense contractors. It is a gold mine. But it only works if the tragic narrative holds up under the spotlight." David stood up from the bar stool. He walked around the marble island, closing the distance between us. He smelled of expensive cologne and alcohol. "Here is the deal," he whispered. "You are going to put on your crisp dress uniform. You are going to pin every single combat medal to your chest. You are going to walk out onto that stage on Saturday night and play the miraculous survivor. You will shake hands with the generals. You will tell the wealthy donors how much this memorial fund saved your life. You will validate the entire operation." I stared at him, gripping my water glass. "And if I refuse?" "If you play your part, I will authorize a 10% cut of the total donations directly into a private account under your name," he countered, ignoring my question. "You walk away with $200,000 in clean cash. You can go buy a new life anywhere you want. It is a generous offer, Leona." He was attempting to buy my complicity. He wanted to turn me into a willing participant in the desecration of my own service record. "I do not want your dirty money, David," I said, my voice hardening just enough to show resistance. "I want my dog." David stopped moving. The air in the dark kitchen grew dangerously still. He tilted his head, observing me with a cold reptilian detachment. "Titan is currently residing at a private security compound in the Western Foothills," he said. "The buyer is a retired Marine named Marcus Thorne." My heart hammered against my ribs. David had tracked the paperwork. He knew exactly where my dog was located. He knew about my only ally. "It is a beautiful piece of property." David continued his tone, shifting into a casual conversational rhythm. "Lots of heavy timber, lots of dry pine needles this time of year. It would be a terrible tragedy if that wooden cabin experienced an accidental electrical fire while the owner was asleep. Old wiring can be so unpredictable in those rural mountain communities." The stakes escalated in a fraction of a second. We were no longer discussing white-collar wire fraud or stolen bank funds. My brother was casually threatening to burn a retired Marine alive. He was threatening to incinerate my dog. He was willing to commit arson and murder to protect his failing software company. The rot inside the Vance family was not just a product of greed. It was a terminal, malignant cancer. They were a parasitic entity feeding on anyone who stood in their way. I realized in that exact moment that there was no line they would not cross. I could not fight them with logic or basic human decency. I had to outplay them. I lowered my head. I let my breathing hitch, forcing a tremor into my hands. The water in my glass rippled. I squeezed my eyes shut and commanded the tears to fall. It was a biological trick I learned treating catastrophic injuries in the field. You control the physical response to manipulate the hostile environment. Hot tears spilled over my eyelashes and tracked down my cheeks. I let out a choked, desperate sob. "Please," I whispered, my voice breaking into a pathetic plea. "Please do not hurt him, David. Do not hurt Titan." David watched me cry. A look of supreme satisfaction washed over his face. He believed he had found the pressure point. He believed the threat of physical violence had shattered my resistance. "Then we have an agreement," he said softly. He reached out and patted my cheek with a cold hand. "Be a good soldier, Leona. Polish your boots. I will see you at the dress rehearsal." He turned around and walked out of the kitchen, heading back toward the grand staircase. I stood alone in the dark, listening to his footsteps fade into the upper hallway. I stopped crying instantly. The tears dried on my skin. I set the water glass down on the marble counter. I raised my left wrist, bringing my smartwatch up to my mouth. I tapped the small illuminated icon on the digital screen. The red recording circle blinked twice and turned gray. Voice memo saved. I had captured every single word. I had his explicit confession regarding the fraudulent structure of the charity. I had his admission of corporate embezzlement. I had the undeniable premeditated threat of arson against a federal witness. My brother thought he had cornered a frightened victim in the dark. He had no idea he just handed a combat strategist the exact audio payload required to orchestrate a legal massacre. The psychological warfare was over. The sabotage phase was about to begin. Thursday morning arrived with heavy humidity pressing against the window glass. 48 hours remained until the charity gala. The countdown clock in my mind shifted from intelligence gathering to active sabotage. I stood in my bedroom holding my secure phone. I typed a single word to Marcus Thorne and hit send. Execute. The digital strike made no sound. No sirens wailed across the coastal Carolina suburbs. No alarms flashed in the pristine corridors of my childhood home. But the financial devastation was instantaneous and lethal. Marcus had deployed his veteran cyber team. They targeted the offshore banking architecture my brother had meticulously constructed. They severed the digital arteries funneling stolen hazard pay into untraceable Caribbean accounts. It took exactly 47 minutes for the shockwave to hit the property. I sat at the marble kitchen island sipping green tea, waiting for the symptoms to manifest. My father was the first to crack. Edward burst through the front double doors, returning early from a country club breakfast meeting. The charming paternal mask he wore for his wealthy peers was gone. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He ignored me entirely, marching straight down the hall into his mahogany office. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, rattling the picture frames on the wall. A moment later, muffled shouting bled through the thick timber. He was screaming at a Cayman Islands bank representative. He demanded to know why his routing numbers returned frozen status codes. His arrogant belief in his own untouchable status was evaporating in real time. He thought playing golf with a local district judge protected him from international financial gridlock. He was wrong. Helen was next. My mother thrives on flawless optics. She needs her environment to run smoothly so she can glide across the surface, projecting the image of Southern aristocracy. Financial instability is her singular weakness. I watched her through the kitchen window. She paced the outdoor stone patio like a trapped animal. She pulled a slender cigarette from a hidden silver case. Her hands trembled so much the gold lighter sparked 3 times before catching the tobacco. She dragged the smoke deep into her lungs, ruining her carefully cultivated, health-conscious persona. Her crisp designer blouse wrinkled. The pristine Carolina matriarch disintegrated right in front of my eyes. I felt a cold, clinical satisfaction watching her fake world burn. The chaos inside the house thickened as the morning dragged into the afternoon. David marched down the grand staircase around noon. His tailored suit jacket was discarded. His expensive silk tie hung loose around his unbuttoned collar. He looked ragged and desperate. The corporate predator was cornered. His medical software startup was hemorrhaging capital. Now his illegal offshore lifeline was severed. The gala vendors demanded final payment before Saturday, and his board of directors expected a liquidity update. He needed immediate access to domestic funds to keep the illusion alive. He found me sitting in the living room pretending to read a floral arrangement brochure. He threw a thick, stapled document onto the glass coffee table. The paper landed with a heavy thud. It was a draconian non-disclosure agreement paired with a domestic asset release form. "Sign it," he demanded. His voice carried a tight, desperate edge. I picked up the document and scanned the legal jargon. He wanted me to legally bind myself to silence regarding the memorial charity. In exchange, the paperwork authorized the bank to unfreeze a secondary domestic trust fund he had set up using my military identification. He claimed it was a routine security measure the bank required because of my prolonged overseas deployment. He told me it was the only way to save the weekend event and secure my promised cut of the donations. He handed me a premium ink pen and hovered over my shoulder. He radiated hostile energy. He thought he was forcing my hand. He believed the threat he made against my dog the night before had secured my ultimate compliance. He had no idea what military survival training entailed. During Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape School, instructors teach personnel how to handle hostile captors demanding signed confessions. You learn to execute a specific, legally invalid signature. You alter the angle of your cursive lettering. You drop distinct vowels and break the baseline of your standard handwriting. To an untrained eye, it looks like the nervous scribble of a terrified prisoner. To a federal handwriting analyst, or a judge examining the document later, it is a universal indicator of physical duress. It renders the contract entirely void. I took the pen. I let my hand shake intentionally. I executed the duress signature perfectly on the dotted line. David snatched the paper the moment the ink dried. A smug, victorious sneer crossed his face. He thought he held a binding contract securing my silence. He actually held a worthless stack of wood pulp. He turned around and walked toward the hallway leading to the garage, eager to drive the documents straight to the local bank branch. I stood up and followed him, intending to head upstairs to my bedroom. I needed to update Marcus on the asset release form. But David stopped at the end of the narrow corridor. He turned around, blocking my path. His analytical mind registered a discrepancy. I was too quiet. I had not argued about the contract. I had not shed any tears. I had simply signed away my rights without a single plea for mercy. The compliance was too easy. He stepped into my personal space, closing the distance between us. He tried to intimidate me, using his height and his physical presence. "You think you are clever, Leona," he sneered. "You think acting numb makes you brave." I kept my face blank. I did not respond. My silence infuriated him. He reached out and grabbed my right shoulder. His fingers dug hard into my collarbone, seeking a pain compliance reaction. He leaned his face inches from mine, preparing to deliver another threat regarding Marcus Thorne and the wooden cabin in the foothills. He expected me to flinch. He expected the broken sister. He triggered muscle memory forged in countless hours of close-quarters combat drills. My reaction bypassed conscious thought. It was instinctual, instantaneous, and clinical. I dropped my center of gravity, planting my boots firmly on the hardwood floor. I brought my left forearm up in a swift arc, trapping his gripping wrist against my chest. I pivoted my hips, rotating his arm outward to break his structural balance. I grabbed his extended thumb with my right hand and applied a sharp, sudden torque. A loud, hollow snap echoed against the hallway walls. David dropped to his knees. He let out a breathless, agonizing gasp. His thumb jutted out at a grotesque, unnatural angle. He clutched his injured hand, pulling it tight against his stomach. His face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. Shock and sudden blinding pain flooded his eyes. I stood over him, perfectly balanced. My breathing remained steady and controlled. I looked down at the corporate golden child writhing on the polished floorboards. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a dramatic speech. "Do not ever touch me again," I said. I stepped over his trembling body and walked up the staircase. I left him kneeling in the shadows of the hallway, nursing a fractured joint and a shattered ego. The physical warning was unmistakable. The broken combat nurse was a myth. The tactical operator was fully awake, and the silent war had just turned physical. Saturday morning dawned with a thick coastal fog rolling off the Atlantic Ocean. The moisture clung to the historic brick facades of downtown Wilmington. I sat in the passenger seat of my father's leased luxury sedan, wearing my pristine dress uniform. The brass buttons and polished insignia felt heavy against my chest. Every commendation pinned to my jacket represented a fraction of the blood and trauma I endured in the desert. My parents wore their designer formal wear like royal garments. They spent the entire drive congratulating themselves on the impending success of their charity gala. The event took place inside a century-old hotel renowned for hosting presidents and foreign dignitaries. We walked through the grand lobby and entered the primary ballroom. The visual display was a staggering monument to hypocrisy. Red, white, and blue bunting draped across the gilded balconies. Dozens of American flags flanked the stage, framing a giant central projection screen. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over round tables set with fine china and imported floral centerpieces. My parents had transformed a room meant for genuine celebration into a theater of treason. They were preparing to strip mine the patriotic reverence of an entire community. I excused myself from the reception line, claiming I needed to verify the digital presentation files. My father waved me away, eager to begin shaking hands with the arriving local politicians. I walked past the catering stations and climbed a narrow, carpeted staircase leading to the audio-visual control room. The elevated booth sat directly opposite the main stage, behind a pane of soundproof glass. A young civilian technician sat at the primary control console, wearing a headset and holding a tablet. He looked up surprised when I opened the door. I stepped inside and let the heavy door click shut behind me. I stood straight, projecting the full authority of my military rank. I did not ask for permission. "I am taking over this station," I said, my voice carrying a crisp command tone. "The tribute slides you were hired to play have been updated. The new presentation contains sensitive operational photography from a forward operating base. Military protocol mandates that only cleared personnel handle the broadcast. You are relieved." The technician blinked. He looked at my dress uniform, my combat medals, and my unwavering stare. Civilian contractors rarely argue with decorated soldiers invoking operational security. He nodded quickly, set his tablet down on the desk, and slipped out of the room. I engaged the deadbolt. The lock mechanism slid into place with a solid metallic thud. I was alone in the control center. The thick glass muted a rising hum of the ballroom crowd below. I pulled a secure, encrypted flash drive from my uniform pocket. This drive did not contain the tear-jerking montage my mother had commissioned. It contained the exact offshore routing numbers, the fraudulent medical records, and the digital evidence Marcus Thorne's cyber team had compiled over the past 48 hours. I inserted the drive into the main console, bypassing the hotel network, and loading my files directly into the projection queue. The payload was primed. I rested my hands on the edge of the desk and looked down at the gathering storm. The ballroom was filling rapidly. The elite residents of the coastal Carolina region moved gracefully between the tables. Wealthy defense contractors mingled with local judges and elected officials. Waiters in white coats circulated with silver trays holding champagne flutes and the imported caviar Helen had purchased using my stolen hazard pay. My eyes scanned the crowd tracking the perimeter. I spotted a tall, broad-shouldered figure entering through the main double doors. Marcus Thorne wore a tailored black tuxedo. He looked nothing like the rugged, retired Marine I met at the mountain cabin. He blended seamlessly into the sea of high society wealth. But a trained operator always recognizes another operator. I watched the way he walked. He did not glide like the politicians. He moved with the calculated, deliberate grace of a predator mapping a hostile environment. Marcus stopped near the center of the room and looked up toward the sound booth. Our eyes met through the glass. He offered a microscopic nod. That silent signal initiated the final lockdown. I watched a dozen men and women wearing standard event security attire fan out across the ballroom floor. They were Marcus's associates, veterans, former intelligence officers, and private contractors. They moved with silent precision. 2 men took up positions flanking the main entrance. Another woman stood casually near the kitchen service doors. They were sealing the exits. The trap was forming a perimeter around the Vance family, and nobody in the room had the slightest clue. Down on the floor, the dramatic irony thickened into a suffocating fog. I located my mother near the front row of tables. Helen was in her element. She wore a stunning emerald silk gown that draped perfectly across her shoulders. Her new diamond tennis bracelets sparkled under the chandelier light. She was holding court with a 4-star general from a nearby base. I could not hear her words through the thick glass, but I could read her lips and her body language. She placed a delicate hand on her chest, performing the role of the grief-stricken mother. She smiled a sad, brave smile and gestured gracefully toward the giant projection screens hanging above the stage. She was explicitly telling the general to pay close attention to the visual tribute. She was actively hyping the very instrument of her own destruction. David stood near the open bar, projecting an aura of corporate success. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch in his left hand. His right hand remained buried deep inside his suit jacket pocket, concealing the rigid splint and the swollen, dislocated thumb I had given him the day before. He chatted animatedly with a group of venture capitalists, eager to spin the night's success into a new funding round for his failing software company. He thought the signed duress document resting in his briefcase guaranteed his salvation. Edward was shaking hands with the local mayor, projecting the image of a selfless philanthropist. He laughed at a joke, clapping the politician on the back. My father believed his careful cultivation of local judges and police officers made him an untouchable king in this coastal city. He believed the golden bubble he built around his family was impenetrable. The digital clock on the control console flashed, indicating the scheduled start time. I reached out and pushed the primary lighting fader down. The crystal chandeliers in the ballroom dimmed smoothly. The ambient chatter of 200 guests faded into a respectful hush. The sudden darkness forced every eye in the room to focus forward. A single, stark white spotlight snapped on, illuminating the wooden podium at the center of the stage. Edward and Helen Vance broke away from their conversations. They walked up the side stairs together, holding hands. They stepped into the bright, heroic glow of the spotlight. The audience broke into a warm, polite round of applause. My parents smiled out at the sea of wealthy donors, military officers, and local elites. They stood at the absolute pinnacle of their social climbing careers. They were ready to reap the ultimate financial harvest. I sat alone in the dark control booth, hovering my finger over the broadcast execution key. I looked at the people who had sold my dog and buried my name to fund their vanity. They were smiling. They were utterly unaware that the countdown to their ruin had already reached 0. Edward stepped up to the wooden podium. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit jacket and adjusted his silk tie. The crystal chandeliers dimmed, leaving him bathed in a crisp, heroic spotlight. The ambient chatter of 200 wealthy donors, defense contractors, and high-ranking military officials faded into a respectful silence. He leaned into the microphone. His voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling, carrying a practiced, somber weight. He did not start by asking for money. He started by discussing the price of freedom. He wove a narrative of sacrifice and duty, laying the patriotic rhetoric on incredibly thick. He knew exactly what the coastal Carolina elite wanted to hear. He played the role of the stoic, burdened patriarch flawlessly. Helen stood half a step behind him. She kept her head bowed, dabbing a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. The optics were pristine. They looked like the perfect grieving parents standing brave against unimaginable hardship. Edward smoothly shifted the narrative toward me. He told the audience about his courageous daughter. He painted a fictitious picture of a combat nurse caught in a devastating mortar attack. He utilized clinical terminology detailing severe blast trauma and permanent cognitive loss. He told the room I was trapped inside a private neurological facility, staring blankly at a white wall, unable to recognize my own family. Down on the ballroom floor, the audience bought the performance entirely. Wealthy businessmen reached into their suit pockets for their checkbooks. The 4-star general seated at the front table nodded with solemn respect. We established the Leona Vance Memorial Canine Fund to honor her legacy, Edward said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. Your generous pledges tonight will ensure that her specialized care continues. Your donations will guarantee that her beloved service dog never goes hungry. Edward turned his back to the crowd and faced the broad projection surface hanging above the platform. He offered a slight nod toward the tinted glass of the audio-visual booth, cueing the technician he thought was sitting in the chair. Please direct your attention to the screens, Edward instructed, pointing upward. I sat alone in the dark control center. My finger rested over the primary execution key. I pressed down. The projector hummed to life, throwing a blinding beam of light across the room. The digital screens did not display a slideshow of my childhood photos. They did not show me in uniform holding an American flag. The screens illuminated the dark ballroom with high-definition financial ledgers. The first slide was a stark, unforgiving spreadsheet. The text was sharp and undeniable. It displayed the routing numbers of the Cayman Islands shell corporation my brother David had built. Highlighted in bright yellow was the source of the incoming capital, my military hazard pay. Highlighted in red were the outgoing expenditures, the boutique jeweler, the South Park Country Club initiation fees, the imported luxury car lease. A strange, unsettled murmur rippled through the attendees. This was not a tearjerker. This looked like a forensic audit. Guests squinted, trying to comprehend the complex routing data. Edward looked up at the projection. The color instantly vanished from his cheeks. His jaw dropped slightly. The charming philanthropist persona shattered, revealing the terrified thief underneath. He spun back toward the podium, gripping the wooden edges so hard his knuckles turned white. He leaned into the microphone. It is a technical glitch, he stammered, his voice pitching up a full octave. Please excuse us. The hotel staff must have loaded the incorrect file. He tapped the microphone housing frantically. The dull, thumping sound echoed across the silent room. He shot a desperate, panicked glare up at the control booth. He waved his hand across his throat, signaling the operator to cut the feed. I did not cut the feed. I had disabled the external overrides the moment I locked the reinforced door. I initiated the automated sequence. The slide advanced. A collective gasp rolled through the front rows. The screens now displayed the forged Department of Veterans Affairs medical document. The fraudulent government seal sat clearly at the top of the page. The military officials in the room recognized the form instantly. The 4-star general sitting near the stage stopped reaching for his pen. He put his reading glasses on. He analyzed the diagnostic codes, declaring me vegetative and legally incapacitated. He knew the strict federal protocols required for such a classification, and he knew the document looked highly irregular. The low murmurs in the crowd morphed into vocal confusion. People began pointing at the glowing numbers. Helen broke character. The lace handkerchief fell from her fingers, fluttering to the stage floor. She grabbed Edward by the elbow, digging her manicured nails into his suit fabric. Do something, she hissed, loud enough for the podium input to pick up the audio. Turn it off right now. Edward abandoned the microphone. He rushed toward the side stairs, shouting for the hotel event manager to kill the main electrical breaker. But the manager was standing near the kitchen service doors, blocked by one of Marcus Thorne's private contractors. No one moved to help my father. The trap held firm. The third slide hit the screen. The image swelled to 10 feet tall. It was the reconstructed bill of sale. The header read, "Transfer of surplus canine" in bold black ink. The purchase price of $30,000 sat directly next to the name Titan. The buyer's signature, Thorne, was plainly visible at the bottom. The reaction from the crowd was visceral. In a room filled with generational military families and prominent defense contractors, the concept of selling a decorated service dog for profit was an unforgivable offense. It was a cultural desecration. The confusion suspended in the air ignited into palpable hostility. The general stood up from his chair, pushing his cloth napkin aside. His face hardened into a mask of pure disgust. "You sold her dog," a voice shouted from the back of the room. It was one of the planted veterans, but the sentiment instantly infected the entire audience. The polite applause from 5 minutes ago transformed into a hostile rumble. David realized the operation was compromised. He abandoned his group of venture capitalists near the open bar. He tried to blend into the shadows, sliding toward the rear service hallway. But 2 men in dark tailored suits stepped into his path. They did not lay a hand on him. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking his escape route. David looked down at his splinted thumb and realized he possessed no tactical advantage. He backed away, trapped in the ballroom with the very people he planned to defraud. The gilded illusion of the Vance family was dissolving in real time. The flawless Carolina aristocrats were exposed as vultures, picking the bones of a soldier they claimed to love. Edward scrambled back to the center of the platform. His hair was disheveled. Sweat beaded on his forehead, reflecting the harsh stage lighting. He gripped the metal stand, trying to salvage his burning empire. "This is a misunderstanding," he begged, gripping the microphone. "This is a cyber attack. My daughter is very sick. She is not in her right mind. These documents are fabricated by hackers to ruin our good name." He was attempting to gaslight a room of 200 intelligent people. He was leaning into the exact defense strategy he had threatened me with in our dining room. He believed he could still talk his way out of a corner. He believed his prominent local voice carried more authority than the digital evidence hanging above his head. I watched him lie through his teeth. The visual assault had stunned them, but Edward was a lifelong politician. He needed a definitive kill shot. He needed evidence that could not be dismissed as a simple computer hack or a clerical error. He needed to hear his own blood convict him in front of the local governor. I reached toward the audio control panel on the mixing desk. I grabbed the master volume slider and pushed it all the way to the top. The visual phase of the execution was over. The audio payload was primed and ready for deployment. I pushed the master audio fader all the way to the maximum limit. The historic ballroom featured a state-of-the-art surround sound system designed to amplify sweeping orchestral arrangements and delicate keynote speeches. Tonight, I repurposed that acoustic engineering to deliver a lethal dose of reality. A brief hiss of digital static filled the vaulted space. Then the crystal-clear recording captured by my smartwatch began to broadcast. My brother David possessed a low, smooth baritone voice. It normally conveyed corporate authority and effortless charm. But the audio echoing off the gilded ceiling was stripped of all professional polish. It was the raw, unvarnished sound of a cornered sociopath. "I built the donor-advised fund," his recorded voice stated bluntly. "I set up the shell corporations. I drafted the charitable charters, and I routed the offshore accounts. Dad might be the face of the operation, but I am the architect." The initial reaction on the ballroom floor was profound physical stillness. 200 high society guests froze in place. Waiters stopped pouring champagne. Women paused with crystal flutes hovering inches from their mouths. The wealthy defense contractors and local politicians stopped breathing. They recognized the voice instantly. Down by the open bar, the group of elite venture capitalists who had just been laughing with David took a collective step backward. They looked at the golden child in his tailored charcoal suit. The charm had evaporated from his face, leaving behind a pale mask of sheer terror. He stared up at the projection booth, his eyes wide, with the realization that his entire financial empire was currently burning to the ground in surround sound. The recording continued, echoing with devastating clarity. "My startup is bleeding cash," David explained to the silent crowd. "We burned through $20 million in seed capital, and the software architecture is a total failure. I need untraceable, unregulated capital to patch the holes in my ledger before the investors demand a federal audit. The charity is my lifeline." The venture capitalist standing near the bar did not wait to hear another word. They operated in a world governed by compliance officers and federal securities laws. Associating with admitted corporate fraud was a career death sentence. 3 men immediately pulled their smartphones from their interior jacket pockets. They began furiously typing messages to their legal teams, instructing them to freeze all pending capital transfers to Vance Medical Technologies. They treated my brother like a radioactive hazard, physically putting distance between themselves and the bar. Up on the brightly lit stage, the dynamic between my parents deteriorated rapidly. Edward Vance lost his grip on the mahogany podium. He stumbled backward, bumping into the projection screen. Helen grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into his suit jacket. She shouted something at him, her face contorted with panic, but her voice was entirely drowned out by the thunderous volume of the audio playback. The broadcast shifted from white-collar embezzlement to calculated extortion. "You are going to put on your crisp dress uniform," David commanded from the speakers. "You are going to walk out onto that stage on Saturday night and play the miraculous survivor. You will shake hands with the generals. You will validate the entire operation. If you play your part, I will authorize a 10% cut of the total donations directly into a private account." A collective gasp swept through the front rows of round tables. The prominent philanthropists who had gathered to write massive checks realized they were the designated victims of a predatory scam. The grief-stricken narrative Helen had sold them was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Edward lunged for the microphone. He gripped the metal housing with both hands, trying to shout over the booming acoustics. "Do not listen to this," he pleaded, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "It is a fabricated file. It is artificial intelligence, a deep fake generated by malicious hackers to ruin our good name. My daughter is severely traumatized. She requires psychiatric confinement." Nobody believed him. The lie was too fragile to withstand the crushing weight of the evidence. The audience possessed eyes and ears. They could read the offshore routing numbers glowing on the screens. They could hear the undeniable inflections and arrogant cadence of David Vance echoing from the walls. Edward was attempting to patch a shattered dam with his bare hands. Then the recording delivered the final, unrecoverable blow. The audio captured my choked, desperate plea to spare my service dog. It was followed by the chilling, measured response from my brother. "Titan is currently residing at a private security compound in the western foothills," the recording stated. "It is a beautiful piece of property. Lots of heavy timber, lots of dry pine needles this time of year. It would be a terrible tragedy if that wooden cabin experienced an accidental electrical fire while the owner was asleep." The cultural context of coastal North Carolina is deeply tethered to military honor. It is a region defined by sacrifice and service. You do not solicit fake donations from Gold Star mothers. You do not steal a decorated combat dog. And you absolutely do not threaten to burn a retired Marine alive inside his own home. The polite confusion in the room instantly hardened into visceral hostility. The 4-star general seated at the primary VIP table stood up. He did not say a word to my parents. He simply tossed his linen napkin onto his untouched plate. His jaw was locked in a rigid line of absolute disgust. He turned his back on the brightly lit stage and signaled for his aides to follow him toward the exit. The state governor reacted next. Political survival dictates immediate separation from toxic scandals. The governor's security detail moved with rapid precision. 2 plainclothes officers flanked the politician, forming a physical barrier between the governor and the stage. They guided him swiftly toward the side doors, treating the Vance family charity event like a hostile threat environment. the mass exodus began. Wealthy donors scrambled to cancel their scheduled wire transfers. Bank applications illuminated the dim room as hundreds of thousands of dollars in promised pledges were digitally revoked in a matter of seconds. People pushed back their chairs, the legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. Edward watched his entire social and financial universe collapse. He screamed into the microphone, demanding order. He ordered the attendees to sit down and listen to his explanation. But his authority had vanished. He was no longer a respected community pillar. He was a cornered thief standing under an interrogation lamp. Helen realized the audience was leaving. She abandoned the podium and rushed toward the carpeted stairs leading off the stage. She intended to intercept the base commander and deploy her tears to salvage the situation. She hiked up her designer emerald gown and hurried down the steps. She did not make it very far. Marcus Thorne had positioned his associates perfectly. The men and women wearing standard event security attire stepped forward from the shadows. They did not draw weapons or raise their voices. They simply formed an impenetrable human wall blocking the aisles. When Helen attempted to push past a broad-shouldered veteran guarding the primary walkway, the man crossed his arms and stared her down with eyes made of flint. Helen took a frightened step backward, retreating up the stairs. David faced a similar blockade near the kitchen service doors. Every exit was sealed. The elegant ballroom had transformed into an upscale holding cell. My parents and my brother found themselves physically trapped on the elevated platform. The stark white spotlight exposed their panic to the entire room. They were entirely surrounded by the very people they had intended to bleed dry. The attendees who were blocked from leaving simply stood in the aisles, glaring up at the stage with undisguised contempt. I sat in the control booth, watching the destruction unfold. The smartwatch recording reached the end of the file and clicked off. The high-definition ledgers remained projected on the giant screens above their heads, a permanent, glowing monument to their greed. The audio assault had decimated their defenses. Their financial assets were frozen. Their corporate reputation was incinerated. Their corrupt local armor was stripped away. But my father was still clinging to the microphone. Even as his world fell apart, he continued shouting into the silent room, claiming that I was a broken, delusional ghost. He insisted I was locked away in a psychiatric ward, unable to distinguish reality from fiction. He was using my supposed absence to shield his crimes. He needed a phantom to blame. I reached forward and pushed the main power button on the audio console. The microphone on the podium clicked off, silencing his desperate lies. I stood up from the padded chair and smoothed the front of my dress uniform. I adjusted the brass pins on my lapel, ensuring every commendation sat perfectly straight. I unlocked the heavy reinforced door of the control booth. It was time to step out of the shadows. It was time to show the Carolina elite exactly what a broken soldier looks like. The audio feed clicked off. The sudden absence of David's recorded voice left the historic ballroom drowning in a heavy, suffocating silence. The acoustics of the vaulted ceiling seemed to capture and suspend the collective breath of 200 guests. Nobody moved. The elite philanthropists, the defense contractors, and the politicians remained frozen in their chairs, processing the sheer magnitude of the deception they had just witnessed. Down on the stage, my father stood paralyzed, gripping the edges of the wooden podium. His knuckles were bone white. His jaw hung slack. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, waiting for the floor to drop. I stepped out of the soundproof control booth and walked toward the edge of the grand balcony. The primary theatrical spotlight operated on an automated tracking system I had reprogrammed 10 minutes earlier. The blinding beam of white light abruptly snapped away from the center stage, leaving Edward and Helen in the dim shadows. The mechanical motors whirred softly as the heavy lighting fixture pivoted upward, sweeping across the crystal chandeliers and locking directly onto my position. I stepped into the harsh, bright circle of illumination. I was not wearing a designer evening gown. I wore my Class A dress uniform. The dark fabric was impeccably tailored and pressed with sharp geometric creases. The brass buttons caught the spotlight, throwing tiny golden reflections across the painted ceiling. My ribbon rack sat perfectly aligned over my left breast pocket, displaying the commendations I earned during consecutive overseas deployments. The fabric of my uniform represented honor, discipline, and undeniable truth. It was the exact antithesis of the gilded lies my family had constructed. I stood dead center on the balcony, directly beneath a massive vinyl banner suspended from the rafters. The bold printed letters spelled out, "The Leona Vance Memorial Canine Fund." I was physically standing underneath the banner declaring my own death. I resurrected myself in front of their most vital audience, weaponizing my own pulse to destroy their narrative. A collective gasp rolled across the ballroom floor. It started near the front VIP tables and rippled backward, hitting the rear service doors like a physical wave. The 4-star general who had been heading for the exit stopped dead in his tracks. He turned around and stared up at the balcony. He looked at the medical documentation projected on the giant screens, claiming I was permanently institutionalized in a vegetative state. Then he looked at the upright, commanding posture of the combat nurse standing 20 feet above him. The illusion shattered permanently. The ghost had returned to balance the ledger. Helen realized the severity of the optical disaster. The pristine Carolina matriarch recognized that the only way to salvage her social standing was to pivot the narrative instantly. She had to play the role of the shocked, overjoyed mother experiencing a miraculous reunion. She hiked the hem of her emerald silk dress and rushed toward the grand curved staircase leading up to the balcony. Her designer heels clicked frantically against the marble steps. "Leona," she cried out, forcing a hysterical tremor into her voice. "Oh my God, you are here. You are healed." She reached the upper landing, holding her arms wide open. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup and leaving dark streaks of mascara across her cheeks. She lunged forward, attempting to wrap me in a theatrical embrace. She wanted the wealthy donors below to see a family coming together. She wanted the physical contact to validate her maternal devotion. I did not break my stride. I maintained a steady, measured pace toward the staircase. As her hands reached for my shoulders, I executed a smooth, clinical sidestep. I shifted my weight, dropping my left shoulder and gliding past her outstretched arms. The evasion was effortless and precise. I denied her the dignity of a hug. I denied her the optics of forgiveness. Helen stumbled forward, grasping at empty air. She nearly lost her balance on the edge of the carpeted landing. The rejection was visible to every single person in the room. A low murmur of disgust echoed from the tables below. The audience watched a mother try to embrace a daughter she had just declared dead for profit, and they watched the soldier refuse the contact. I walked down the grand staircase holding the thick manila folder in my left hand. The folder contained the original forged medical records, the reconstructed bill of sale for Titan, and the printed routing numbers for the offshore accounts. It was the physical ammunition required to secure federal indictments. The crowd parted as I reached the ballroom floor. Wealthy socialites and powerful executives stepped backward, clearing a wide path. They looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and genuine horror. They parted like the ocean, allowing me to march directly toward the front rows. My initial target was the local chief of police. He was seated at a prime table near the stage wearing a tuxedo that looked noticeably tight across his shoulders. He represented the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the building. Handing the physical evidence to him in front of 200 witnesses, including a state governor, was supposed to corner the corrupt local network, forcing them to act against my father. I locked my eyes on the chief and closed the distance. But as I drew nearer, my tactical training flagged a severe behavioral anomaly. The police chief was not looking at me. He was not looking at the explosive evidence projected on the screens. He was sitting slumped in his chair, staring down at his lap. The blue glow of a smartphone screen illuminated his sweating face. His thick thumbs were flying across the digital keyboard, typing with frantic, desperate speed. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a cloth napkin. I slowed my pace slightly, shifting my line of sight to trace his focus. I looked past the round tables toward the service doors where my brother David was currently trapped. David was also staring down at a glowing smartphone. He read a message on the screen, and his pale face contorted into a snarl of pure rage. He rapidly typed a response, his thumbs mirroring the exact panicked cadence of the police chief. The realization hit me like a physical strike to the ribs. My father was not the only one utilizing local corruption. Edward played golf with the district judge to shield his country club lifestyle. But David operated on a much higher financial frequency. My brother built corporate startups. Startups require silent investors. They require individuals with disposable income who want to multiply their wealth without their names appearing on public regulatory filings. The police chief wore a watch that cost more than a standard patrol vehicle. He was not just a lazy bureaucrat protecting my father for a donation to the Police Athletic League. The chief was a silent equity partner in Vance Medical Technologies. He was deeply financially tethered to my brother. If I handed the original manila folder to the local police department, the evidence would vanish before morning. The chief would confiscate the documents under the guise of an official investigation. The forged medical records would be accidentally misplaced in an evidence locker. The chain of custody would break. David and the chief would bury the financial ledgers to protect their mutual investments. Handing the folder to local law enforcement was equivalent to throwing the evidence directly into a blazing fire. I was 5 feet away from his table. The chief finally looked up from his phone, spotting my approach. He forced a stiff, unnatural smile, attempting to project an aura of authority. He stood up, reaching his hand out, anticipating the transfer of the dossier. I stopped. I did not break eye contact, but I pivoted my boots sharply to the right, altering my trajectory by 90 degrees. The sudden shift in movement caught the chief off guard. His outstretched hand hovered in the empty space between us. I walked right past his table, ignoring his presence entirely. I bypassed the corrupt local safety net without a single word of explanation. The tactical situation had mutated, and I needed a much heavier weapon. I scanned the silent ballroom, searching the sea of stunned faces for the one man who operated entirely outside the Carolina political machine. I found him standing near the central chandelier. Marcus Thorne looked immaculate in his tailored evening wear, but his posture was coiled and ready for violence. He had watched the entire silent exchange between myself, the chief, and David. He saw my pivot, and he understood the tactical implication instantly. The local option was compromised. I locked eyes with the retired Marine. I gave him a single, sharp nod. It was the signal we had established during our planning phase at the mountain cabin. It was the command to abandon the conventional approach and initiate the ultimate contingency protocol. We were no longer playing a local game of chess. We were calling down a federal airstrike. Marcus returned the nod. He reached inside his tuxedo jacket, pulling a secure, encrypted communication device from his interior pocket. He did not dial a local precinct. He bypassed the city and the county entirely, hitting a direct speed dial number for a contact operating on a much higher tier of the justice system. The silent war was over, and the real hunters were about to enter the building. I walked across the remaining distance separating me from Marcus Thorne. The heavy manila folder felt like a loaded weapon in my left hand. I did not look back at the stage, where my parents stood, paralyzed under the harsh glow of the projection screens. I did not glance at the local police chief, who sat sweating over his compromised smartphone. I kept my eyes locked on the retired Marine. He extended his right hand. I placed the dossier into his palm. The physical transfer of evidence marked the end of my solo campaign and the beginning of a coordinated military strike. Marcus took the folder. The tailored black tuxedo he wore did nothing to hide the lethal posture of a man who spent 3 decades executing high-threat security operations. He turned his back on me and faced the stunned audience. He did not ask for a microphone. He did not need artificial amplification to command the room. He possessed the raw, booming authority of a seasoned combat veteran. "My name is Marcus Thorne," he announced, his deep, gravel voice cutting through the thick silence of the ballroom. "I served 30 years in the United States Marine Corps. 2 months ago, the people standing on that stage came to my home. They sat on my porch and told me a story about a brave combat nurse who suffered a catastrophic blast injury. They told me she was locked inside a private neurological ward, unable to walk or speak. They begged me to buy her decorated service dog because they desperately needed the funds to keep her alive. A fresh wave of shock rippled through the gathered crowd. The wealthy donors and defense contractors stared at Edward and Helen. The facade of the grieving parents shattered into 1,000,000 unrecoverable pieces. I handed Edward Vance $30,000. Marcus continued pacing slowly across the open floor. I considered it a sacred duty to help a wounded sister-in-arms. But Edward did not use that money to pay for medical care. He used it to fund a luxury car down payment. He traded a hero for a piece of imported German machinery. He looked a Marine in the eye and lied about a soldier's traumatic brain injury to line his own pockets. In North Carolina, military reverence is not a superficial trend. It is the foundational bedrock of the community. Countless families in that room had sent their sons and daughters to foreign deserts. Some of those children returned with lifelong wounds. Some never returned at all. To hear a prominent local businessman casually invent a combat casualty for financial gain was an unforgivable desecration. It was a cultural sin of the highest order. The local police chief realized the situation was rapidly spiraling out of his control. He stood up from his table, shoving his smartphone into his pocket. He puffed out his chest, attempting to assert municipal authority over the escalating crisis. "Hold on a minute, Thorne," the chief interrupted, stepping into the aisle. "You are making very serious accusations in my jurisdiction. I need to take custody of those documents. We will conduct a proper internal review at the station tomorrow morning." The chief reached his hand out, intending to confiscate the dossier and bury the evidence alongside his own fraudulent investments. Marcus stopped pacing. He turned and looked down at the corrupt bureaucrat. A cold, predatory smile crossed his weathered face. "Your jurisdiction ended the moment you decided to invest in a criminal enterprise," Marcus replied, his tone dropping to a dangerous hush. "We know about the silent equity shares. We know about your text messages to David Vance. You do not have the authority to write a parking ticket in this room tonight." The police chief froze. The color drained from his face as the realization hit him. His secret financial lifeline was exposed in front of the local governor and 2 base commanders. He slowly lowered his hand, taking a frightened step backward. Marcus turned his attention away from the trembling chief. He looked toward the rear of the ballroom near the primary entrance. He offered a sharp nod. A man wearing a simple gray suit stepped forward from the shadows. He did not look like a soldier or a wealthy socialite. He carried a worn leather briefcase and wore wire-rimmed glasses. He projected an aura of quiet, relentless bureaucracy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, gesturing toward the newcomer, "allow me to introduce the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of North Carolina." I invited him here tonight to witness this presentation firsthand. The introduction hit the room like a physical shockwave. The federal government had entered the building. The intricate web of local corruption Edward and David relied upon was instantly rendered obsolete. You cannot bribe a federal prosecutor with a country club membership or a donation to the Police Athletic League. The United States Attorney operates on a tier of justice immune to small-town influence. Marcus walked over to the federal prosecutor and formally handed him the thick manila folder. The attorney opened the clasp, pulling out the forged medical records, the reconstructed bill of sale, and the highlighted offshore bank routing numbers. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud, extortion, and stolen valor. David Vance realized the trap had clamped shut. He stood near the open bar, his dislocated thumb throbbing inside his suit jacket pocket. His analytical mind ran through the tactical variables and arrived at a terrifying conclusion. The local police could not save him. His offshore accounts were frozen. The audio recording of his extortion threat was ringing in the ears of a federal prosecutor. He was looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary. The golden child abandoned his parents without a second thought. He dropped his crystal glass of scotch onto the carpeted floor. He turned around and bolted toward the kitchen service doors. He intended to slip out the back loading dock, steal a catering van, and reach the interstate before the arrest warrants were signed. He slammed his shoulder against the swinging wooden doors, bursting into the sterile fluorescent light of the hotel kitchen. He did not make it past the prep stations. 3 men, wearing standard catering uniforms, stood blocking the narrow hallway leading to the loading dock. They were not hotel employees. They were veterans, recruited by Marcus Thorne. They possessed the broad shoulders and thick necks of infantry soldiers. They did not draw weapons or raise their voices. They simply formed an impenetrable human wall. David skidded to a halt, his expensive leather shoes sliding on the tile floor. He looked at the 3 men evaluating his chances of breaking through their perimeter. He was a white-collar consultant nursing a fractured hand. He was facing 3 trained operators who spent their careers securing hostile environments. "Step aside," David demanded, his voice cracking with panic. The veteran, standing in the center, folded his thick arms across his chest. He did not say a word. He simply took one slow, deliberate step forward. David scrambled backward, retreating from the physical threat. He pushed back through the swinging wooden doors, stumbling out of the kitchen and returning to the bright lights of the ballroom. The veteran associates followed him out. They flanked him on both sides, gripping his upper arms with iron force. They marched the corporate predator down the center aisle, forcing him to face the crowd he tried to swindle. They pushed him forward until he stood at the base of the stage, directly below the projection screens, displaying his own financial crimes. Edward and Helen watched their son return as a captive. They stood paralyzed on the elevated platform, bathed in the harsh white spotlight. Their designer clothes and expensive jewelry offered no protection. They were entirely stripped of their stolen wealth, their counterfeit reputation, and their corrupt local armor. The federal net had closed around the Vance family, sealing them inside a nightmare of their own design. There was nowhere left to run. I stood near the balcony stairs watching the architects of my suffering realize they were finally out of time. The United States Attorney closed the thick manila folder. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and offered a single concise nod toward the rear of the historic ballroom. The tactical shift occurred in the span of a heartbeat. The social destruction of the Vance family ended. The brutal legal consequence began. 4 individuals stepped through the main entrance. They wore dark navy windbreakers. The bright yellow letters spelling out the Federal Bureau of Investigation glowed under the dim, ambient hotel lighting. The agents moved with quiet, synchronized efficiency. Their heavy boots echoed against the polished hardwood floor, cutting through the stunned silence of the elite crowd. They bypassed the compromised municipal police chief entirely. The local bureaucrat kept his head down, staring at his shoes, eager to avoid federal scrutiny. The agents split their formation. 2 officers marched straight toward the kitchen service doors, where David Vance stood flanked by the veteran security contractors. The other 2 agents ascended the carpeted stairs, heading directly onto the brightly lit stage. David attempted to leverage his corporate pedigree one last time. He stood tall, adjusting his ruined silk tie. He demanded to call his elite defense attorney. He cited his Ivy League credentials and his status as a prominent medical software chief executive. The federal agents ignored the arrogant display. They treated him like a common street-level thief. An agent grabbed David by the shoulders, spinning him around to face the wall. The officer pulled a pair of cold steel handcuffs from his utility belt. David gasped as his arms were wrenched behind his back. The metal restraints clicked sharply over his wrists. The steel chain pulled tight against his splinted thumb. A sharp jolt of pain shot up his arm, causing his knees to buckle slightly. The corporate predator groaned, realizing his pristine education offered zero protection against a federal indictment. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud," the agent recited in a flat, monotone voice. "You are facing additional charges of grand larceny and interstate extortion. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning echoed across the grand ballroom. Hearing those words spoken in a venue designed for champagne toasts and philanthropic speeches carried a surreal heavy weight. The wealthy venture capitalists who had funded his failing startup watched the golden child squirm in federal custody. Up on the elevated platform, the remaining 2 agents closed in on Edward and Helen. The Carolina aristocrats found themselves trapped in the harsh white glare of the projection spotlight. The high-definition offshore bank ledgers continued to glow on the massive screens above their heads, providing a digital backdrop for their physical capture. Helen tried to deploy her southern charm. She forced a trembling smile and reached a manicured hand toward the approaching officer. She attempted to explain that the entire situation was a dreadful misunderstanding, orchestrated by a sick, confused daughter. Her voice shook with profound terror. The agent did not return the smile. He reached out and grasped her wrist with firm clinical authority. He pulled her arm behind her back. Helen let out a shocked, indignant gasp. The crisp fabric of her emerald silk designer gown crinkled as the agent secured the handcuffs. The pristine matriarch was reduced to a restrained federal suspect. Before leading her off the stage, the officer paused. He noticed the blinding flash of refracted light catching the stage bulbs. He looked down at the heavy diamond tennis bracelet circling her cuffed wrist. The agent pulled a clear plastic evidence bag from his jacket pocket. This item was purchased utilizing embezzled federal funds, the agent stated plainly. It is subject to immediate asset forfeiture. He unclasped the platinum hook. The heavy diamond jewelry slid off her skin. It dropped into the plastic evidence bag with a dull, degrading thud. The officer pulled the zipper shut, sealing her stolen wealth away. He handed her a carbon copy receipt for seized property. The procedural humiliation stripped Helen of her final layer of armor. She looked down at her bare wrist and began to weep tears of genuine defeat. Edward collapsed. His carefully constructed facade of philanthropic superiority dissolved into pathetic cowardice. His legs gave out beneath him. The federal agents caught him by the armpits, preventing him from hitting the stage floor. They dragged him upright, securing his wrists in iron. He whimpered like a frightened child. He begged the officers to listen to reason. He promised to repay every single stolen dollar. He offered to write a check on the spot to clear the ledger. The pathetic bargaining only amplified his guilt. The agents ignored his pleas, gripping his biceps and steering him toward the stairs. The perp walk commenced. The officers marched the Vance family down the center aisle of the ballroom. They paraded the criminals right through the heart of the coastal elite community they had attempted to defraud. Edward dragged his expensive Italian leather shoes across the ornate hotel carpet. As they passed the primary VIP table, he spotted the state governor standing near his security detail. Edward reached out a trembling, cuffed hand. He begged the politician for a character reference. He pleaded for political intervention. The governor did not say a word. He raised his hand, signaling his plainclothes bodyguards. The security men stepped forward, forming a solid physical barrier. The governor turned his back, refusing to acknowledge the begging thief. The ultimate social rejection landed like a physical blow. Edward dropped his head, weeping openly, as the agents pulled him toward the exit. The audience reacted to the procession. Wealthy donors and local politicians reached into their pockets, pulling out their smartphones. Bright flashes of digital cameras illuminated the dim ballroom. The attendees documented the historic downfall, capturing photographs of the handcuffs and the tears. The images would hit the Morning Society pages before dawn. The disgrace was permanently archived on hundreds of servers, cementing their ruin. I stood at the base of the grand balcony stairs watching the spectacle unfold. I did not scream in triumph. I did not pump my fist or break down into emotional sobs. I maintained perfect posture, my boots planted firmly on the hardwood floor. My dress uniform reflected the ambient light. Every brass button and polished metal served as a testament to survival. I observed the federal extraction with the clinical detachment of a combat nurse managing a severe casualty tent. When you identify a necrotic tumor destroying a healthy body, you do not celebrate the tumor. You simply excise the diseased tissue, sterilize the wound, and stitch the healthy skin back together. My family was the infection. I had diagnosed the rot, exposed the symptoms, and applied the necessary surgical cure. I felt nothing but a hollow, profound sense of completion. The heavy wooden double doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open. The agents marched Edward, Helen, and David out into the humid Carolina night. Through the tall glass hotel windows, I watched the red and blue emergency lights of waiting federal cruisers slice through the coastal fog. The doors closed, sealing the Vances out of the venue and out of my life. The physical extraction was complete. Marcus Thorne walked over and stood quietly by my side. The hotel ballroom remained silent, save for the faint, fading wail of sirens retreating down the avenue. The guests stared at the empty stage, trying to process the magnitude of the exposure. The physical arrests provided immediate justice, but the tactical operation was far from finished. The federal indictments represented only the first phase of their destruction. The true penalty for their greed awaited them in the cold daylight of the coming weeks. Their assets were frozen, their shell companies exposed, and their luxury loans called due. The structural liquidation of the Vance empire was about to begin, leaving them with a debt they could never repay. The morning after the charity gala, the coastal fog burned off, revealing the harsh, unforgiving daylight of accountability. The federal justice machinery does not operate with dramatic flair or emotional outbursts. It operates with a cold, bureaucratic efficiency that grinds its targets into dust. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched the Vance family legacy undergo a rigorous structural liquidation. I did not observe the destruction from the sidelines. I sat in the center of the command tent, working directly with the prosecution to ensure the strike was comprehensive and final. I spent my mornings in the downtown office of the United States Attorney. The wood-paneled walls and polished conference tables offered a stark contrast to the sterile concrete holding cells where my parents now resided. We mapped out the specific charges, tracing every stolen dollar. The prosecutor compiled a staggering list of federal offenses: wire fraud, identity theft, interstate extortion, the exploitation of a disabled veteran for financial gain. I provided the digital ledgers Marcus Thorne and his cyber team extracted from the encrypted drives. I signed sworn affidavits detailing the forged medical records and the illicit sale of my service dog. I felt no pity during these interrogations. I operated with the precise clinical satisfaction of a combat nurse excising a necrotic infection from a healthy body. The collapse of my brother David was the swift and brutal. The corporate golden boy woke up on Sunday morning wearing a scratchy county-issued uniform instead of his tailored charcoal suits. The morning financial news networks ran continuous coverage of the ballroom arrests. The corporate world reacts to federal indictments with ruthless self-preservation. The board of directors for his medical software startup convened an emergency meeting before sunrise. They held a unanimous vote. They terminated his position as chief executive officer. They erased his name and his photograph from the company website. The elite venture capitalists who witnessed his downfall firsthand filed immediate civil suits to recoup their investments. David was financially excommunicated. He attempted to leverage his Ivy League pedigree to secure high-powered legal representation. He used his daily allotted phone call to contact a prestigious defense firm in the state capital. The senior partner accepted the call, only to deliver a crushing reality check. The attorney informed David that his offshore accounts were frozen. The domestic trusts were seized under federal asset forfeiture laws. The lawyer demanded a $500,000 cash retainer up front just to review the case file. David hung up the phone, realizing the depth of his ruin. The architect of the fraudulent charity was entirely bankrupt. He would face a federal judge, relying on an overworked public defender. Helen experienced a distinct psychological torture tailored specifically to her vanity. She was housed in a temporary federal detention center waiting for her arraignment. The pristine Carolina matriarch traded her emerald silk designer gowns for a stiff cotton jumpsuit. The ultimate blow to her identity did not come from a judge or a prosecutor. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon via the detention center mailroom. A guard handed her a single envelope printed on heavy premium cardstock. It was a formal notice from the board of directors at the South Park Country Club. The letter bypassed pleasantries and stated coldly that her membership was revoked in perpetuity due to conduct unbecoming of the institution. They formally banned her from the manicured grounds and the dining halls she had spent decades trying to rule. Helen wept inside her cell holding the crisp stationery. She did not cry because she faced a lengthy prison sentence. She cried because her elite social status was officially terminated. She was a pariah in the only world she valued. Edward fared no better in his isolated confinement. He exhausted his phone privileges trying to reach his powerful connections. He dialed the private cell phone of the local district judge, hoping to call in a favor from their many golf games. The call went straight to a generic automated voicemail. He dialed the municipal police chief. The number returned a disconnected signal. The Coastal Elite Network amputated the Vance family to prevent the federal scrutiny from spreading. Edward was an untethered liability. The patriotic community of North Carolina unleashed a wave of unyielding backlash. Local news stations interviewed the grieving Gold Star mothers Helen had scammed. Veterans groups organized protests outside the corporate headquarters of Edward's investment firm, holding signs demanding maximum sentences for the theft of a military working dog. Clients pulled their portfolios en masse. His business dissolved in less than 72 hours, leaving a hollow corporate shell. The physical dismantling of their empire materialized on a humid Thursday afternoon. I parked my sedan across the street from the sprawling colonial estate where I grew up. The manicured front lawn looked identical to the day I returned from my overseas deployment. But the circular brick driveway told a vastly different story. 2 heavy-duty commercial flatbed tow trucks idled on the paving stones. The drivers secured thick steel chains to the front axles of the imported German luxury sedans my parents leased using my hazard pay. The hydraulic winches groaned loudly, dragging the expensive vehicles up the steep metal ramps. The bank seized the cars to satisfy the defaulting lease agreements. I watched the tow trucks rumble down the street, hauling away the ultimate symbols of their stolen prestige. The financial institution holding the primary mortgage on the estate wasted no time. David had used the colonial house as collateral to secure the initial bridge loans for his fake charity. The federal indictments triggered an immediate default clause in the lending contract. The bank initiated a fast-track foreclosure, seizing the property to recoup the fraudulent debt. I walked across the quiet street and stepped onto the empty driveway. A white commercial utility van pulled up to the curb. A licensed municipal locksmith stepped out, carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. I watched him walk up the brick steps to the wraparound porch. It was the exact same spot where Helen had sat sipping sweet tea and lying to my face about a dangerous nuisance. The locksmith approached the heavy oak double doors. He removed his power drill and began extracting the old locking cylinders. He worked with practiced efficiency, pulling the brass hardware from the wood. He installed shiny new deadbolts securing the structure on behalf of the bank. I stood in the humid coastal air, absorbing the profound poetic justice of the moment. My parents had sold my service dog and forged documents to erase my existence. They had locked me out of my own life to fund their insatiable greed. Now the federal government and the banking institutions had locked them out of theirs. The fortress they built using my blood and my military service was repossessed. I listened to the sharp metallic click of the new locks engaging. The sound was clean and definitive, sealing the tomb of the Vance family legacy forever. The transition from the sterile courtroom where my parents were sentenced to the county property auction felt like crossing a bridge between my past and my future. The autumn air carried a crisp chill, replacing the suffocating coastal humidity that had defined my turbulent homecoming. I stood on the concrete steps of the municipal courthouse, holding a cashier check in my jacket pocket. The funds represented my fully recovered combat hazard pay, alongside a substantial federal restitution payout the judge had ordered during the sentencing hearing. The bank had fast-tracked the foreclosure of the Vance estate. The sprawling colonial property was listed on the public auction block. A dozen local real estate developers crowded the courthouse steps, eyeing the prime suburban acreage. They wanted to flip the mansion for a quick profit. They saw a lucrative investment portfolio. I saw a battlefield that required immediate and permanent sterilization. The auctioneer read the property description in a rapid, monotonous drone. The bidding started low. The developers raised their numbered paddles, exchanging casual nods. I waited until the price reached the current market value. The crowd assumed the bidding war was over. A developer, wearing a tailored suit, lowered his paddle, anticipating a victory. I raised my hand and called out a number that silenced the courtyard. I bid $10,000 over the asking price, paying entirely in cash. The auctioneer pointed his wooden gavel in my direction. He called the final warnings and slammed the mallet down. The property was sold. I walked into the county clerk's office and signed the official deed. The interior of the building smelled of old paper and floor wax. I handed over the certified check and received the heavy paper document in return. I owned the land. The soil where my parents had betrayed me now belonged to the combat nurse they tried to erase. I did not buy the estate to live in the shadow of their greed. I bought it to execute a final structural purge. 2 weeks later, I stood on the sidewalk across the street from the property. 3 giant yellow excavators idled on the brick circular driveway. The heavy diesel engines rumbled, shaking the pavement beneath my boots. The demolition crew supervisor handed me a bright orange hard hat. He asked if I was ready to begin. I gave him a single, sharp nod. The mechanical arm of the primary excavator swung backward and lunged forward. The steel bucket crashed through the front double doors. The heavy oak splintered into jagged fragments. The machine tore into the grand foyer, ripping the crystal chandelier from the painted ceiling. Glass rained down onto the hardwood floors in a glittering cascade. I watched the destruction with profound serenity. The operator drove the steel tracks over the pristine flower beds and smashed into the side of the house. The mahogany-paneled office where Edward Vance had threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward collapsed under the weight of the steel claw. The marble kitchen island where David had tried to extort my service record was pulverized into white dust. The walls caved inward, the roof buckled and surrendered to gravity. The colonial mansion, representing the ultimate symbol of their counterfeit prestige, was reduced to a mountain of broken timber and twisted copper wire. I stayed on the sidewalk until the dump trucks hauled away the final load of debris. The lot was scraped clean down to the bare Carolina dirt. The toxic history was permanently excavated. The real work began the following Monday. I did not leave the cleared earth empty. I possessed a vision forged during 18 grueling months in a combat zone. I poured the foundation for a specialized rehabilitation and training facility dedicated to retired military working dogs. I wanted to build a sanctuary for the canine veterans who had sacrificed their physical and mental health to keep soldiers alive. The construction site hummed with purposeful energy. The ringing echo of framing hammers and the steady hum of power drills replaced the silence of the empty neighborhood. I hired a crew comprised entirely of local military veterans. The site became a rallying point for the patriotic community. I did not manage the complex architectural project alone. Marcus Thorne introduced me to his sister-in-law, Maya, who quickly became the cornerstone of the operation. Maya is a brilliant African-American woman who served 20 years as a logistics officer and combat engineer in the Navy. She brought a level of precision to the project that only a seasoned veteran could provide. She mapped out the drainage systems, the reinforced fencing, and the specialized veterinary triage rooms. Maya treated the crew with tough love, bringing homemade meals to the site on Fridays and demanding flawless perfection on the structural joints. She stepped in as the lead project manager, walking the perimeter every morning, holding a rolled set of blueprints. Her commanding presence anchored the project, providing a fierce maternal energy that the Vance family had always lacked. She understood the unspoken bond of military service, and she treated the canine facility like a sacred monument. Titan thrived in the dust and the noise. The sterile, sanitized kennel my parents had built was gone. Titan now spent his days roaming the active construction zone, following Maya around during her inspections and acting as her unofficial shadow. He slept contentedly on a thick canvas blanket near the temporary command trailer, surrounded by a scattered collection of heavy-duty chew toys. His coat was thick and his eyes were bright. He recognized the veterans on the crew offering low, happy barks whenever they tossed him a tennis ball during their lunch breaks. Whenever a delivery truck arrived, Titan would sit proudly near the gate, serving as the designated sentry. He was no longer treated as a dangerous nuisance or a financial asset. He was honored as a decorated member of the team. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut lumber and poured concrete. I stood near the edge of the property line watching Maya inspect the framing for the new indoor agility course. A familiar dark heavy-duty truck turned off the main road and pulled onto the freshly laid gravel driveway. The engine cut off and the driver door opened. Marcus Thorne stepped out of the cab. He wore his faded utility shirt and rugged cargo pants, looking relaxed and at peace. He did not arrive as a stranger or a distant ally. He arrived as the patriarch of the family I had actively chosen to build. He walked over holding 2 steaming cups of black coffee. He handed one to me and looked out over the bustling site. He pointed toward the main structure where the kennel bays were taking shape. The walls were thick and the doors were reinforced with solid steel frames. "It looks like a fortress, Leona," he said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. I looked down at Titan, who was currently resting his heavy chin against my work boots. I reached down and stroked the soft fur behind his ears. I thought about the sweltering July afternoon when I first dropped my canvas duffel bag on the pavement. I thought about the rusted padlock and the horrifying realization that my own blood had sold my greatest protector. I had walked into a meticulously engineered trap, designed by people who valued country club memberships over human life. They had stripped my bank accounts and attempted to steal my sanity, but they fundamentally misunderstood the resilience of a soldier. They broke my heart, but they could not break my discipline. I used their arrogance against them, turning their gilded stage into a federal execution block. I took a sip of the dark coffee. The bitter warmth grounded me in the present moment. I looked up at the wooden rafters rising against the clear blue Carolina sky. "It is a fortress," I replied, my voice steady and certain, "and the foundation is solid." I had returned home to a profound betrayal and an empty chain-link enclosure. I fought through a labyrinth of corruption and lies to reclaim my partner. I stood on the freshly cleared earth, breathing in the clean air. I had built an unbreakable sanctuary right on top of the ruins of my enemies. The silent war was officially over, and I was finally home. We spend the majority of our lives striving to build impenetrable fortresses. We purchase homes with expansive wraparound porches in quiet, immaculately manicured neighborhoods. We pay dues to the right country clubs, attend the prestigious social galas, and painstakingly curate an image of traditional American success. We want the world to look at our families and see a flawless, enviable portrait of prosperity and warmth. But the chilling narrative of a combat nurse returning from a war zone to an empty chain-link kennel forces us to confront a terrifying, unspoken question. What happens when the fortress we build for our children is actually an emotional trap designed entirely to serve ourselves? Leona's return from the desert was not met with the warm, tearful embrace of a loving family. Instead, she was met with the horrifying realization that her parents had sold her most loyal companion, a decorated military dog, simply to finance their own vanity. This ultimate betrayal was not conceived in a single impulsive day. It was the inevitable, tragic climax of decades spent prioritizing public perception over private integrity optics, over honesty, and greed over parental love. In modern American culture, there is a dangerous, pervasive tendency to conflate financial prosperity with moral virtue. We are implicitly taught that providing a comfortable, affluent life, the imported European cars, the Ivy League tuitions, the sprawling colonial estates, is the absolute fulfillment of our parental responsibility. But raising children with depth and character requires far more than simply balancing a household ledger or displaying a perfect, coordinated family portrait in the grand foyer. It demands acute emotional awareness, an unwavering commitment to honesty, and the rare courage to see our children for who they truly are, rather than what they can do to elevate our social reputation. The parents in this narrative failed spectacularly, not because they lacked the financial resources to provide, but because they lacked a moral soul. They looked at a daughter who chose the grueling, honorable, and selfless path of military service and saw only a liability to their pristine country club aesthetics. They willingly traded the sacred duty of long-term parental guidance for the cheap, fleeting thrill of local social validation, proving that an empty heart cannot be filled with diamond tennis bracelets. This toxic dynamic is most glaringly exposed in the stark dichotomy between the golden child and the family scapegoat. When parents abandon fairness and equity, they do not merely inflict deep psychological wounds upon the unfavored child. They fundamentally destroy the moral compass of the favored one. By blindly worshiping a son's elite medical degree while deliberately ignoring his sociopathic greed and manipulative tendencies, the parents in this story nurtured an apex predator under their own roof. They implicitly taught him that rules were strictly for the lower classes, that truth was entirely malleable, and that human beings, even his own sister, were merely liquid assets to be exploited. Emotional awareness in parenting means recognizing the unique, inherent value of each child without pitting them against one another in a ruthless, gladiatorial contest for affection and approval. When love becomes conditional, tethered strictly to performance and prestige, children learn to survive through manipulation rather than genuine connection. The tragic irony is that by desperately trying to protect and elevate their golden child at all costs, these parents engineered their own absolute and public ruin. True family responsibility is not a passive, inherited title granted by the random lottery of genetics. It is an active, deliberate, and daily choice to show up, to protect, and to honor the vulnerable among us. When Leona stood directly in the crosshairs of her biological family's betrayal, she did not find salvation or comfort in her bloodline. She found it in the unyielding loyalty of a retired Marine, the fierce maternal protection of a fellow veteran who understood the weight of sacrifice, and the silent, heavy devotion of her service dog. These profound connections remind us that the traditional family structure is only as resilient as the fundamental truth it stands upon. A house built on a foundation of lies, exploitation, and gaslighting will inevitably collapse under the crushing weight of its own hypocrisy, regardless of how many crystal chandeliers hang from the ceiling. We must actively teach our children that loyalty cannot be bought with stolen funds, and respect cannot be demanded through a forged power of attorney. They must be earned through a lifetime of honest, selfless actions. The uncomfortable, silent truth is that the smoking ruins of this particular estate are not an isolated anomaly. Similar quiet betrayals occur every single day behind heavy oak doors in the most prestigious and envied zip codes in the country. We routinely see families fractured not by spectacular cinematic villains, but by quiet, insidious selfishness and the slow daily erosion of moral boundaries. It is a harsh and deeply unsettling reality to face, but acknowledging it is the first mandatory step toward breaking the generational cycle of trauma. If you have ever felt the sharp sting of conditional love, if you have ever been forced to shrink yourself to fit into your family's preferred narrative, or if you recognize the dark shadows of this story in your own history, you are not alone. Please consider subscribing to Luke Vengeance. Join our growing community, share your own lived experiences in the comments below, and walk with us as we continue to explore the dark, hidden corners of human relationships, always seeking the harsh but necessary light of accountability and truth. As we look at the freshly cleared earth where a gilded mansion once stood, the dust settling over the wreckage, we are left to deeply ponder the true legacy we leave for the next generation. Conventional wisdom and traditional societal norms dictate that family is an unbreakable, sacred bond, a sanctuary that must be preserved and defended at all absolute costs. We are taught from childhood to forgive endlessly, to turn the other cheek, and to sweep the ugliest truths under the rug in the name of keeping the peace and protecting the family name. But I offer a vastly different, perhaps unsettling perspective. Blood does not automatically command respect. It merely provides an introduction. The most profound, radically authentic act of love you can offer your child is not blind, unconditional protection from the severe consequences of their own actions, nor is it the selfish demand for their eternal submission to your ego. It is the willingness to let them burn down the toxic structures you built if those structures serve only to imprison their spirit. Sometimes the only way to honor the true, pure meaning of family is to walk away from the one you were given and have the terrifying courage to build your own fortress on the ashes of the past. Are we raising children to be independent, morally sound adults, or are we simply breeding hostages to serve as reflections of our own vanity? The locks have changed, the old keys no longer work, and the house is gone. Who ultimately holds the keys to your legacy?